p-hacking. A scientist wants to prove that eating blueberries makes people run faster. She runs an experiment with 100 people and finds nothing, no significant difference. But instead of stopping there, she starts slicing the data in different ways. Maybe blueberries work better for people under 30. Maybe only for those who eat them in the morning. Maybe only for people with blue eyes. She keeps analyzing until, finally, she finds something. A tiny statistical link between blueberry consumption and sprint speed in left-handed people. Success. Or is it? This is the problem with manipulating data until it produces a significant result. In scientific research, statistical significance is often measured by something called a p-value. If the p-value is below a certain threshold, usually 0.05, the result is considered meaningful. But here's the trick. If you test enough different possibilities, eventually, just by chance, something will appear to be significant. It's like rolling a die over and over, and then only reporting the times you rolled a 6. The worst part? The result still looks scientific. It gets published in journals, reported in the media, and spread as fact. Blueberries boost athletic performance, the headlines scream. But in reality, it was just a statistical fluke. A number that looks impressive, but means nothing. And because people only see the studies that worked, thanks to publication bias, they never realize how many others found nothing. This doesn't just happen in nutrition studies. It's everywhere, from medicine to psychology to economics. And the consequences can be serious. It leads to misleading health advice, ineffective treatments, and wasted resources. Real science isn't about finding exciting results. It's about finding the truth, even when the truth is boring. And sometimes, the most important finding is that there was nothing to find at all. Publication bias. A scientist conducts a study on a new drug. The results? It has no effect. Another researcher tests a popular psychological theory and finds no supporting evidence. A third scientist runs a trial on a promising therapy, only to discover it doesn't work as expected. What happens to these studies? More often than not, they disappear. This is the hidden flaw in scientific research. Studies with exciting, positive results are far more likely to be published than those with neutral or negative findings. Journals prefer breakthroughs over dead ends. Researchers, under pressure to advance their careers, focus on studies that tell a compelling story. Funding agencies are more likely to support projects that promise big discoveries, rather than ones that yield inconclusive or disappointing outcomes. But when negative results go unpublished, the scientific record becomes skewed. Imagine 10 studies testing a new treatment. 9 show no effect, but 1 finds a small benefit. If only that one gets published, the world sees an incomplete picture, making the treatment seem effective when it's not. This can lead to wasted resources, misleading conclusions, and even harmful medical practices. This bias also affects public perception. People rarely hear about studies that found nothing significant, reinforcing the idea that every new scientific claim is groundbreaking. A diet study showing a certain food prevents disease makes headlines, while 5 others showing no effect never see the light of day. The result? A public bombarded with sensationalized and often misleading information, shaping beliefs based on an incomplete set of facts. True progress in science isn't just about discovering what works, it's also about understanding what doesn't. The missing data, the studies that didn't confirm expectations, and the failures all hold valuable lessons. Without them, we're not seeing reality, we're just seeing the highlights. File drawer effect. Try to picture yourself fishing in a vast ocean, trying to determine what kind of fish live there. Every time you cast your net, you only catch large, colorful fish, while the smaller, less noticeable ones slip through. Based on your catch, you might assume that only big, vibrant fish exist in this ocean. But in reality, you're missing a huge part of the picture. This is exactly what happens in scientific research due to the file drawer effect. When researchers conduct studies, they don't always get the results they expect. Sometimes, their experiments show no effect, contradict prior research, or just don't reach statistical significance. These studies are far less likely to be published because journals prefer groundbreaking findings. The problem is that when only successful studies make it into the public eye, we end up with an incomplete, misleading view of reality. Imagine a team of psychologists testing whether a new teaching method improves student performance. They run 10 different studies. One of them shows a small improvement, while the other 9 show no difference at all. The study with positive results gets published, while the others are quietly set aside. If you were to read only that one published paper, you'd think the teaching method was effective when, in truth, the full body of research suggests otherwise. This effect is particularly dangerous in medicine, where treatments might seem more effective than they truly are because failed studies remain hidden. It also fuels trends in business, technology, and even self-help, where a single promising study can launch an entire industry while conflicting evidence stays buried. The next time you hear about a new proven theory, ask yourself, how many studies are left unseen? Because sometimes the truth isn't in the research we read, it's in the research that never made it out of the drawer. One of the most simple and common mental traps people fall into is confirmation bias, one that quietly shapes our beliefs without us even realizing it. Imagine you're in a debate about a topic you feel strongly about. You search online for proof that you're right, and sure enough, you find articles, studies, and expert opinions that support your view. See, the facts back me up, you think. But did you ever stop to consider the evidence against your position? Or did you only look for information that confirmed what you already believed? This is confirmation bias in action. Our tendency to seek out, interpret, and remember information that supports our existing beliefs while ignoring or dismissing anything that contradicts them. It's why people with different political opinions can look at the same event and come away with completely different conclusions. It's why superstitions persist, conspiracy theories thrive, and long-held misconceptions refuse to die. Once an idea takes root in our minds, our brain instinctively works to defend it, even at the cost of reality. Psychologist Peter Wason demonstrated this in the 1960s with a simple experiment. He gave people a number sequence and asked them to determine the rule behind it. Instead of testing a variety of possibilities, most people only looked for evidence that confirmed their initial guess, never stopping to challenge their assumptions. This same mistake happens everywhere, from scientific research to courtroom decisions to everyday arguments with friends. What makes confirmation bias so dangerous is that it feels like rational thinking. It tricks us into believing we're being objective when we're actually just reinforcing our own mental echo chamber. The only way to break free is to do something uncomfortable. Actively seek out opposing viewpoints, challenge our own assumptions, and stay open to the idea that we could be wrong. Because sometimes, the truth isn't what we want to hear. It's what we refuse to accept. False memory syndrome. Picture waking up one day with a vivid memory of an event that never happened. You remember every detail, the colors, the emotions, even the people involved. But when you try to verify it, there's no record of it ever occurring. This isn't a glitch in the matrix, it's false memory syndrome. False memory syndrome is when people develop deeply ingrained yet completely false memories. These aren't just small misremembered details. They can be entire events that feel just as real as actual experiences. This phenomenon can be shaped by suggestion, repeated storytelling, or external influences like media and therapy. One of the most unsettling aspects of false memory syndrome is how easily it can be triggered. In one study, researchers showed participants childhood photographs edited to place them in a hot air balloon, a ride they had never taken. After repeated exposure, many participants remembered the ride, even adding sensory details like the wind in their hair or the thrill of looking down. Their brains had filled in the gaps, constructing a completely false experience. This effect can have serious real-world consequences. In the 1980s and 90s, numerous cases of recovered memories of childhood abuse surfaced, often during therapy sessions. Many of these memories were later found to be false, implanted unintentionally through suggestive questioning. These cases led to broken families, wrongful imprisonments, and deep psychological distress, all because the mind had mistaken fiction for reality. False memory syndrome reveals an uncomfortable truth. Our past isn't set in stone. It's fluid, shaped by the way we recall it, the people around us, and even the words used to describe it. So the next time you're absolutely sure about something from your past, ask yourself, do you remember it, or do you just believe it? Magical thinking. You're watching a basketball game, and your team is down by 5 points. In desperation, you whisper, if they score on this next play, we'll win. The moment the ball swishes through the net, your heart races. Did you just influence the game? Magical thinking is the belief that our thoughts, words, or small actions can affect the world in ways that defy logic. It's why people make wishes on birthday candles, avoid saying things out loud for fear of jinxing them, or believe in lucky objects. Deep down, we know there's no real connection between what's in our minds and what happens in reality. Yet, our brains love patterns, and when a coincidence reinforces a belief, we latch onto it. Children do this instinctively. They believe stuffed animals have feelings, that stepping on cracks will break their mother's back, and that their thoughts alone can make things happen. But even as adults, we don't fully outgrow it. If someone gives you a sweater that belonged to a criminal, it suddenly feels tainted, even though the fabric itself hasn't changed. This kind of thinking can be harmless, even comforting. It helps us feel in control in an unpredictable world, but it can also mislead us. Believing that thinking positively will make bad news disappear might stop someone from taking action. And in extreme cases, magical thinking fuels conspiracy theories, pseudoscience, and irrational fears. The truth is, reality doesn't bend to our thoughts, but the way we think does shape our actions, and our actions shape the world. So maybe the real magic isn't in the rituals we perform, but in the decisions we make based on what we choose to believe. Superstition. You're about to take an important test, and just before walking out the door, you realize you don't have your lucky pen. Panic sets in. You scramble through drawers, convinced that without it, you'll fail. Deep down, you know the pen doesn't actually affect your knowledge, but you can't shake the feeling that it does. Superstition has a strange grip on the human mind. We throw salt over our shoulders, avoid walking under ladders, and knock on wood, believing these small rituals can change reality. Logically, it doesn't make sense. How could a black cat crossing your path influence your fate? But to the brain, patterns matter. When something good or bad happens after a particular action, we link the two, even if they're unrelated. This isn't just a quirk of modern life. It's been ingrained in human behavior for centuries. Ancient warriors carried charms into battle, believing they'd protect them. Athletes today have rigid pre-game routines, convinced they improve performance. Even stock market traders fall into patterns, trusting specific strategies based on past luck rather than logic. The reason superstition thrives is simple. It gives people a sense of control in an unpredictable world. Life is full of uncertainty, and our brains crave order. If wearing a certain shirt or following a ritual makes you feel more confident, you might actually perform better, not because of magic, but because belief itself is powerful. But while superstition can provide comfort, it can also hold us back. It can make us afraid of harmless things, prevent us from taking risks, or convince us that luck matters more than effort. So the next time you hesitate before stepping on a crack or worry about Friday the 13th, ask yourself, are you in control, or is superstition controlling you? Synchronicity, misinterpretation. You're thinking about an old friend you haven't spoken to in years. Just as you reach for your phone, a notification pops up. It's a message from them. Your heart skips a beat. What are the odds? It must be a sign, right? Moments like these feel too perfect to be coincidences, leading many to believe that the universe is sending them a message. This is the misinterpretation of synchronicity, the tendency to see deep meaning in random events simply because they align in an unusual way. Our brains are wired to seek patterns. We evolved this ability to detect danger, predict outcomes, and make sense of a chaotic world. But sometimes we overdo it. When two unrelated things happen close together, we instinctively link them, even if they're purely coincidental. It's why people think dreaming of an owl before bad news means the owl was an omen, or why someone might believe they manifested a new job by visualizing it. In reality, coincidences are inevitable. In a world of billions of people and infinite events happening every second, strange connections are bound to occur. But our minds don't like accepting randomness. It feels unsettling, almost empty. So we attach meaning, creating stories where none exist. This isn't always a bad thing. Finding meaning in events can be inspiring or motivating, but mistaking coincidence for fate can also be misleading. You might avoid an opportunity because you think a bad omen warned you, or trust in luck instead of preparation. Maybe the real magic isn't in the event itself, but in how we respond to it. Instead of assuming the universe is nudging us toward a path, perhaps we should take the moment as a reminder to reflect, take action, or simply appreciate the strange beauty of chance. Cyber-utopian bias. In the early days of the internet, people believed it would usher in a golden age, one where information would set us free, democracy would flourish, and society would become more equal. No more gatekeepers, no more misinformation, no more oppression, just pure, unfiltered truth at everyone's fingertips. That dream didn't exactly pan out. Cyber-utopian bias is the tendency to believe that technology, particularly the internet, will inherently lead to positive social progress. It's an optimistic illusion that assumes digital advancements automatically solve human problems rather than amplify them. In reality, technology reflects human nature, flaws and all. Take social media. Initially, it was seen as a way to connect people, foster understanding, and give everyone a voice, and in some ways it does. But it also fuels misinformation, deepens social divides, and turns online spaces into battlegrounds of outrage. Similarly, artificial intelligence was supposed to eliminate bias, but instead, it often mirrors and reinforces the prejudices already present in society. This bias persists because technological innovation feels like magic. Every new development promises something revolutionary: a smarter world, a fairer system, a better life. But people forget that tools are only as good as the hands that wield them. The printing press spread knowledge, but it also spread propaganda. The radio connected the world, but it also amplified war efforts. The internet gave us Wikipedia, but it also gave us deepfakes. Instead of assuming technology will fix everything, maybe the real challenge is ensuring it serves humanity rather than the other way around. Blind faith in progress isn't progress. It's just another illusion wrapped in code. The future won't be built by technology alone. It'll be built by the people who decide how to use it. Fora effect. Let's suppose a teacher hands back graded essays, but instead of individual feedback, every student receives the same comment. You have a strong ability to think critically, but sometimes you second-guess yourself. Your writing is engaging, though there's room for improvement in structure. Keep pushing yourself, and you'll achieve great things. Most students nod in agreement, feeling that the teacher really understands their strengths and weaknesses. But what they don't realize is that the feedback wasn't tailored at all. It was a one-size-fits-all statement designed to sound personal. This is the fora effect in action. It happens when people accept vague, general statements as highly specific and meaningful to them. Fora effect is about our brain's natural tendency to to personalize broad descriptions, even when they could apply to anyone. Psychologist Bertram Forer demonstrated this in an experiment where he gave students a personalized personality test result. The catch? Every student got the same generic evaluation, yet nearly all of them rated it as highly accurate. This bias influences everything from personality quizzes to corporate feedback, even medical self-diagnosis. When someone tells us something that seems uniquely insightful, we often fail to ask, is this really about me, or could it apply to almost anyone? It's a reminder that not all insights are as personal as they seem. We just convince ourselves they are. Barnum effect. Imagine walking into a carnival tent, drawn in by a sign that reads, Madame Celeste knows your soul. You sit down, and she studies you carefully before saying, you're someone who can be outgoing at times, but also need your space. You have big dreams, but sometimes feel like you hold yourself back. People don't always see how much you truly care, but deep down, you have a strong sense of loyalty. Your jaw drops. How could she possibly know all that? The truth is, she doesn't. She just mastered the art of saying things that apply to nearly everyone. This is the Barnum effect, named after the legendary showman P.T. Barnum, who famously said, "There's a sucker born every minute." It's a psychological trick that makes vague, general statements feel uniquely personal. Unlike the Forer effect, which describes how people believe generic personality assessments, the Barnum effect focuses on how people are intentionally misled by statements designed to feel specific. Fortune tellers, astrologers, and even certain personality tests use this tactic to create the illusion of deep insight. The power of the Barnum effect lies in the way it exploits our natural tendency to seek meaning. When someone tells us something about ourselves, we instinctively search for ways it might be true, even ignoring details that don't quite fit. It's why horoscopes seem accurate, why psychics can read people, and why online quizzes feel eerily spot on. But here's the real trick. Once you realize how it works, you start seeing it everywhere. The next time you're amazed by how well a description fits you, ask yourself, was it really that personal? Or was it just a well-placed mirror reflecting back what you wanted to see? Ad hominem fallacy. Your argument is invalid because you're just a college student. You can't trust what she says about climate change. She's not even a scientist. Notice something. Neither response actually engages with the argument being made. Instead, they go straight for the person saying it. This is one of the oldest tricks in the book, attacking the messenger instead of the message. It happens everywhere, in politics, in social media debates, even in everyday conversations. If someone points out a flaw in a policy, they might get dismissed as too young to understand or too biased to take seriously. If a scientist presents research someone doesn't like, they might say, well, they're just in it for the grant money. These kinds of responses are powerful because they shift the focus. Instead of debating the idea, the debate becomes about whether the person is even worth listening to. Why does this trick work so well? Because it's easy. It takes effort to engage with an argument, to think critically, to weigh evidence. It's much simpler to take a shortcut. Attack the person instead, cast doubt on their credibility, and move on. But here's the catch. Bad people can still make good points, and good people can still be wrong. An idea should be judged on its own merits, not on who's saying it. The next time a debate turns personal, pay attention. Is the argument being addressed, or is the person being attacked? A real discussion is about ideas, not insults. Because once the focus shifts to discrediting the speaker, the truth is no longer the priority. Winning is. And that's where meaningful conversation dies. Appeal to authority. A famous actor once claimed that a certain vitamin could prevent cancer. Sales of that vitamin skyrocketed overnight. But here's the problem. He wasn't a doctor, a scientist, or even remotely qualified in medicine. He was just well known, and that was enough. This is a perfect example of how people fall for an argument not because of evidence, but because of who is making it. If an authority figure, whether it's a celebrity, a CEO, or even just someone with a fancy title, makes a claim, many people automatically assume it must be true. After all, they sound confident, they have influence, and they seem to know what they're talking about. But authority alone doesn't equal accuracy. Of course, listening to experts is usually a good idea. A trained pilot is obviously a more reliable source on aviation than your neighbor. But the danger comes when people rely entirely on status rather than substance. Just because a Nobel Prize winner makes a claim outside their field doesn't mean it's valid. Just because a doctor endorses a product doesn't mean it's effective. Even experts can be wrong. And sometimes, authority figures have agendas, whether it's money, fame, or simply being too stubborn to admit a mistake. So the next time someone tries to convince you with a name rather than a fact, ask yourself, what's the actual evidence? Authority can be useful, but it's not a shortcut to the truth. Because when people stop questioning and start blindly following, it's not knowledge they're gaining, it's obedience. Appeal to ignorance. In the 1950s, some scientists argued that smoking wasn't dangerous. Their reasoning? There was no definitive proof that cigarettes caused lung cancer. Decades later, overwhelming evidence confirmed the link, but by then, millions had suffered the consequences of an argument based on ignorance. This kind of reasoning is everywhere. If there's no proof that aliens don't exist, then they must be real. If no one has found Bigfoot, that means he's out there, just really good at hiding. The flaw in this thinking is simple. A lack of evidence isn't proof of anything. Just because something hasn't been disproven doesn't mean it's true. And just because something hasn't been proven doesn't mean it's false. This fallacy can be used to manipulate people in dangerous ways. A politician might say, "There's no proof that my opponent didn't commit a crime." A company might claim, "There's no evidence our product doesn't work." In both cases, the burden of proof is flipped upside down, forcing people to disprove a claim rather than requiring solid evidence to support it in the first place. Real knowledge doesn't come from filling in gaps with assumptions. It comes from recognizing what we don't know and demanding real evidence before accepting something as fact. Because when people rely on ignorance as proof, they aren't uncovering the truth, they're just making it up. Strawman fallacy. I think schools should have better funding. Oh, so you want to throw unlimited taxpayer money at schools without accountability? That's ridiculous. Notice the problem. The first statement is reasonable, but the response twists it into something extreme, an exaggerated version that's easier to argue against. This is how a common trick in debates works. Instead of addressing an opponent's actual argument, it misrepresents it into a weaker, more absurd version. It happens in politics, online arguments, and even casual conversations. If someone suggests eating less meat for health reasons, another might respond, "Oh, so you want to ban hamburgers and force everyone to be vegan?" If one person says they support stricter background checks for gun buyers, someone else might counter, "So you want to take away everyone's guns and leave people defenseless?" The goal is to misrepresent an argument, so it's easier to dismiss. The trick works because people often react emotionally rather than logically. Instead of taking the time to clarify what was actually said, they respond to the distorted version. This turns discussions into battles, where the goal isn't understanding, it's just winning. The best way to spot this is to listen carefully. If someone's response feels like an extreme leap from what was originally said, it's worth asking, "Is that really what I meant?" More often than not, the exaggerated version exists only to be torn down. A real discussion happens when both sides engage with each other's actual points, not the imaginary ones built out of straw. Because at the end of the day, it's easy to win an argument against a made-up opponent, but it won't get anyone any closer to the truth. Slippery slope fallacy. If we allow students to use calculators in class, soon they'll stop learning basic math. Then they won't be able to solve simple problems without technology. Before we know it, the entire education system will collapse, and no one will know how to do math at all. This kind of argument might sound dramatic, but it's surprisingly common. It's built on the assumption that a small step in one direction will inevitably lead to a disastrous outcome. In reality, the supposed chain of events is often exaggerated, with no real proof that one thing will lead to the next. It happens in all kinds of debates. Legalizing a certain drug. Some will argue that it will lead to a society-wide breakdown. Changing a school policy. Critics may claim it will ruin education forever. Even in everyday life, people use this reasoning without realizing it. If I skip one workout, I'll get lazy, stop exercising completely, and become unhealthy. In each case, the assumption is that one action will trigger an unstoppable downhill spiral, when in reality, there are many factors in between. The trick is effective because fear is a powerful motivator. When people imagine worst-case scenarios, they're more likely to act out of caution, even if the scenario itself isn't realistic. But not every decision sends you tumbling into chaos. Most changes happen in small, controlled steps, and there are always opportunities to adjust along the way. So the next time someone claims that one small choice will lead to inevitable disaster, take a step back. Instead of asking, what if everything goes wrong? Consider, what if nothing does? The future is rarely as fragile as fear makes it seem. Cherry picking. A new health trend claims that eating only grapefruit can help you lose 10 pounds in a week. The article backing it up cites a study where participants who ate grapefruit every day lost weight. Sounds convincing until you realize the study didn't mention exercise, calorie intake, or any other possible factors. Other studies that found no significant weight loss? Conveniently ignored. This psychological trick happens when people selectively pick information that supports what they want to believe while ignoring anything that contradicts it. It's not just in diet trends. It's everywhere. Politicians use it by highlighting only statistics that make them look good while brushing off the rest. Businesses do it by showcasing glowing reviews, but leaving out the bad ones. Even in personal arguments, people tend to remember details that support their point while forgetting those that weaken it. It's easy to fall for because it feels like proof. Seeing a few hand-picked facts can be convincing, especially when they line up with what we want to believe. But reality isn't so simple. Imagine trying to solve a puzzle with only the pieces that fit your narrative. You'll end up with an incomplete, distorted picture. The real danger? It creates echo chambers. When people only consume information that reinforces their views, their beliefs become stronger, more extreme, and harder to question. The truth gets lost, buried under carefully chosen fragments of reality. So next time something seems overwhelmingly one-sided, ask, what's being left out? Sometimes the missing pieces matter more than the ones in front of you. Black swan fallacy. For centuries, Europeans believed all swans were white. It wasn't just a theory. It was considered a fact, reinforced by every swan anyone had ever seen. Then, in 1697, Dutch explorers arrived in Australia and found something shocking: black swans. Suddenly, an assumption that had seemed unshakable was shattered in an instant. This is the essence of the black swan fallacy, assuming that just because something has never happened before, it never will. It's an error in thinking that blinds people to rare, unpredictable events simply because they haven't yet experienced them. History is full of moments that seemed impossible until they happened. Before 2008, most people believed the housing market was stable. Then the financial crisis hit. Before September 11th, large-scale terrorist attacks on American soil seemed unthinkable. Before COVID-19, a global pandemic shutting down the world economy felt like the plot of a sci-fi movie. In hindsight, these events seem obvious, but before they occurred, they were dismissed as unrealistic or paranoid thinking. This fallacy affects everything from business to personal life. Investors assume a stock will keep rising because it always has. Governments fail to prepare for disasters that haven't happened in recent memory. People avoid buying insurance because they've never had an emergency before. Then, when the unexpected strikes, they're caught completely off guard. The truth is, the most impactful events in history are often the ones nobody sees coming. Dismissing them just because they haven't happened yet is like assuming all swans are white, until the day you finally see one that isn't. The real lesson isn't to live in fear of the unknown, but to stay open to the idea that the world is far less predictable than we'd like to believe. Texas sharpshooter fallacy. A man fires dozens of shots at the side of a barn. Then he walks up, finds the tightest cluster of bullet holes, and paints a bullseye around them. Now, it looks like he's an incredible marksman, when really, he just made the target after the fact. This is exactly how the Texas sharpshooter fallacy works. Instead of looking at all the data objectively, people focus only on the patterns that support their conclusions and ignore the rest. It's a mental trick that makes randomness look meaningful. Think about conspiracy theories. A few random events line up, so someone weaves them into a grand narrative, ignoring all the times things didn't match up. Or consider health trends. One study finds a handful of people in a certain town who got sick after eating a particular food, and suddenly, it's blamed as the cause, even though there's no real statistical connection. It even shows up in business. A company might boast about how its product boosted sales in 5 test markets, but conveniently ignore the 10 markets where sales dropped. Investors see patterns in stock prices and convince themselves they've cracked the code, when really the market is just chaotic. The problem with this fallacy is that it tricks people into seeing certainty where none exists. It makes coincidences seem intentional, leading to bad decisions based on cherry-picked data. Real accuracy isn't about finding patterns after the fact. It's about testing predictions before they happen. The question isn't whether a pattern exists, but whether it truly means anything at all. Hasty generalization. A single bad experience can be enough to change the way we see the world. Imagine you go to a new restaurant and the waiter is rude. The food takes forever, and when it finally arrives, it's cold. Walking out the door, you shake your head and mutter, "This place is terrible." But is it really? Maybe the waiter was having a bad day. Maybe the chef was dealing with a broken stove. Maybe, on any other night, that restaurant serves incredible food with excellent service. But one experience was enough to form a sweeping judgment. And that's the trap of hasty generalization. This cognitive shortcut happens when we take a small sample of information and assume it applies to everything. One lazy employee convinces us an entire company is unprofessional. One bad driver from another state makes us think everyone from there is terrible on the road. A single misleading news article creates an opinion about an entire group of people. Social media and the internet amplify this effect. If a viral video shows a person from a certain profession, city, or political group doing something foolish, thousands of people will suddenly declare, "They're all like that." But in reality, they aren't. A handful of examples don't prove a rule. Recognizing this fallacy takes effort because our brains like shortcuts. It's easier to make quick judgments than to think critically. But the next time an opinion starts forming based on just a few examples, pause. Ask, do I really have enough evidence to be sure? Because sometimes one bad meal doesn't mean the whole restaurant is awful. It just means you need to try another dish. Misinformation effect. Imagine you witness a car accident. A few days later, someone asks, "Did you see the shattered glass?" You hadn't noticed any, but now the image of broken glass starts to feel real in your memory. The problem? There wasn't any. This is the misinformation effect at work. This psychological trick occurs when false or misleading information distorts your recollection of an event. Your memory isn't a perfect recording. It's more like a story that gets rewritten each time you recall it. New details, even incorrect ones, can blend into your original memory, making you believe something that never actually happened. Studies on the misinformation effect reveal just how easily our memories can be manipulated. In one famous experiment, participants watched a video of a car accident and were later asked how fast the cars were going when they smashed into each other. Others were asked the same question, but with the word hit instead of smashed. Those who heard smashed reported the cars going much faster and even remembered seeing glass that wasn't there. A simple change in wording altered their entire perception of the event. This effect has serious consequences, especially in eyewitness testimony. People who see a crime can have their memories unknowingly altered by leading questions, media reports, or discussions with others. This has led to wrongful convictions, as false memories can feel just as real as true ones. But it's not just crime scenes. This effect influences history, personal relationships, and even politics. Repeated exposure to misinformation can make us confident in things that never actually happened. So the next time you recall an event, ask yourself, is this really how it happened, or is it just how I remember it? Because sometimes the difference is bigger than we think. False consensus effect. Suppose you're at a restaurant with friends and you casually mention that pineapple on pizza is an abomination. You expect everyone to nod in agreement, because obviously that's the correct opinion. But instead, one friend looks horrified and defends it as the perfect combination of sweet and savory. You're baffled. How could anyone not see it your way? This is the false consensus effect in action, the tendency to overestimate how much other people agree with our opinions, beliefs, and behaviors. We assume our views are the normal ones, simply because they make sense to us. This bias happens for a few reasons. First, we surround ourselves with like-minded people, so our opinions get reinforced. If everyone in your social circle loves a certain TV show, it's easy to assume that everyone does. Second, we're naturally egocentric. Our brains default to the belief that our way of thinking is the default setting for all humans. And third, admitting that people see the world very differently can be unsettling, so we subconsciously avoid it. The false consensus effect can have real-world consequences. It can make people overconfident in political arguments, assuming their stance is universally accepted. It can lead businesses to misjudge what customers actually want. It even plays a role in social conflicts, where both sides assume they have overwhelming support when in reality, opinions are more divided than they think. So next time you're certain that everyone thinks the way you do, take a step back. Is that really true? Or is your brain just tricking you into seeing a world that looks a little too much like you? Understanding this bias won't make pineapple on pizza any less controversial, but at least you'll know why the debate never ends. Self-serving bias. You ace a test and you tell yourself it's because you studied hard and are naturally good at the subject. But if you fail, well, the teacher made the exam unfair, or the questions were worded strangely, or maybe you just had an off day. Notice the pattern. When things go well, we take the credit. When they don't, we blame external factors. That's the self-serving bias at work. This psychological trick helps protect our self-esteem. It's comforting to believe that our successes are entirely our doing, while our failures are someone else's fault. It keeps us feeling competent and in control, but it can also distort reality. Athletes often attribute victories to skill and preparation, while losses are blamed on bad referees or poor weather. Employees take personal credit for workplace achievements, but blame a toxic environment when things go wrong. Even in relationships, people tend to think they are the reasonable one and their partner is the difficult one. Self-serving bias isn't just about ego, it shapes how we see the world. It can stop us from learning from mistakes because, well, we don't see them as our mistakes. It can make conflicts worse, as both sides feel justified in their actions. And it can hold us back from improving, since it's hard to fix a problem you don't think you caused. But here's the paradox. Recognizing this bias in ourselves is tough because naturally we assume we are more objective than others. So, the next time you succeed, pause and consider if outside factors played a role. And when you fail, ask yourself, was it really just bad luck, or is there something you could have done differently? The way you answer might reveal more about your mind than the situation itself. Optimism bias. You speed past a red light, convinced you won't get caught. You put off studying, sure you'll somehow ace the test anyway. You smoke a pack a day, believing lung cancer happens to other people. This isn't just wishful thinking, it's the optimism bias, a mental shortcut that makes us believe we're less likely to experience bad outcomes than others. It's the reason people think their marriages will last, even though divorce rates say otherwise. It's why gamblers are convinced their next spin will be a jackpot. And it's what makes startup founders believe their business will be the one that defies the odds, even when most new companies fail. At first glance, optimism bias seems like a flaw. After all, if we underestimate risks, aren't we setting ourselves up for failure? Maybe, but that's not the whole story. This bias can also be a powerful motivator. If people accurately predicted how much effort, rejection, and failure go into writing a book, starting a company, or chasing a dream, many might not even try. Optimism gives us the courage to take risks, push forward, and believe in a future that logic might call unlikely. But unchecked optimism has its dangers. It makes us ignore warning signs, procrastinate, and underestimate challenges. We assume we'll always have more time, more luck, more chances, until we don't. The key isn't to abandon optimism, but to balance it with a dose of reality. Hope for the best, yes, but plan for the worst. Because sometimes, expecting things to magically work out is the very reason they don't. Pessimism bias. A dark cloud on the horizon doesn't always mean a storm is coming, but try telling that to the human brain. When faced with uncertainty, many people instinctively brace for disaster, assuming that the worst possible outcome is the most likely one. This tendency is known as pessimism bias, a psychological quirk that convinces us things will go wrong, even when logic suggests otherwise. Imagine two people applying for the same job. One submits their resume and assumes they have a solid chance. The other hesitates, convinced they'll be rejected, so they either delay applying or write a half-hearted cover letter. When the rejection email arrives, their belief is confirmed. See, I knew it. But was it fate, or did their own negativity contribute to the result? Pessimism bias distorts how we interpret the world. A single bad experience, whether it's a failed relationship, a financial loss, or an embarrassing moment, can overshadow 100 good ones. It's why people fear flying more than driving, even though statistics show the opposite is safer. It's why some refuse to invest in the stock market, assuming a crash is always imminent. And it's why one critical comment can linger in the mind for years, while compliments fade into the background. Ironically, pessimism can feel like self-protection. If you expect disappointment, you think you won't be caught off guard. But in reality, it leads to hesitation, avoidance, and unnecessary stress. The future is uncertain. Sometimes things will go wrong, but just as often, they won't. The real trick is recognizing that expecting the worst doesn't make you wise. It just makes you miss out on everything that could go right. Dunning-Kruger effect. A man walks into a talent show, brimming with confidence. He belts out a song, completely off-key, oblivious to the pained expressions of the judges. When they tell him he's terrible, he looks shocked. How could they not see his talent? This moment, both cringeworthy and fascinating, is a perfect example of the Dunning-Kruger effect. A cognitive bias where people with low ability in a certain area mistakenly believe they're much more skilled than they actually are. This effect happens because a lack of knowledge makes it hard to recognize incompetence. Imagine someone who just learned a few chords on a guitar. To them, it might feel like they're just steps away from being a rock star. But an experienced musician knows how much they don't know, the complexity of fingerpicking, improvisation, music theory. Ironically, as expertise grows, confidence often dips for a while because the person becomes more aware of their limitations. The Dunning-Kruger effect explains why beginners can be overly confident, while experts, who see the vastness of their field, may underestimate their own knowledge. It's why someone who's watched a few online videos about investing might believe they can beat Wall Street, while an economist with years of experience knows how unpredictable the market really is. This bias doesn't just lead to embarrassing moments, it can be dangerous. Overconfident drivers take more risks, unqualified leaders make poor decisions, and uninformed individuals spread misinformation with absolute certainty. The cure? Intellectual humility. The more willing we are to question our own knowledge, the more we can actually grow. Because the real mark of intelligence isn't believing you know everything, it's understanding just how much there is to learn. Stereotype threat. Before an important math test, a teacher casually mentions a study showing that boys tend to outperform girls in mathematics. Suddenly, some of the girls in the class start to feel uneasy. They second-guess their answers, their confidence wavers, and, despite being just as capable, their scores end up lower than usual. This is stereotype threat in action, a psychological phenomenon where people underperform when reminded of a negative stereotype about their group. It's not just about gender and math. Stereotype threat can affect anyone. A student from a lower income background might hear that kids from wealthier schools do better on exams and start to doubt themselves. An older worker might be reminded that young people are better with technology and suddenly struggle with a software update. Even professional athletes can experience it. If reminded that their racial or national group supposedly lacks a certain skill, their performance can suffer. The problem isn't ability, it's pressure. When people become aware of a stereotype about their group, they worry about confirming it. This stress eats away at focus, making simple tasks harder. Studies show that just mentioning a stereotype before a test can be enough to lower scores. On the flip side, removing these reminders allows people to perform at their true potential. Stereotype threat doesn't just affect individuals. It shapes society. It discourages talented people from pursuing certain careers, reinforces existing inequalities, and makes stereotypes seem true when they're actually self-fulfilling. The good news: awareness is the first step to breaking the cycle. When people recognize that these pressures exist, they can fight back against them, proving that no label or expectation defines what they're truly capable of. In-group bias. You're at a party where you barely know anyone. Then, across the room, you hear someone mention your favorite sports team, hometown, or even just a shared hobby. Instantly, you feel a connection. They're one of us. Without even thinking, you gravitate toward them, ready to trust, bond, and agree with whatever they say. Now, imagine another person at the same party who supports your rival team or holds an opposing opinion. Before they even finish speaking, you already feel distant, skeptical, maybe even defensive. Why? Because your brain is wired to favor those who seem like part of your group and to distrust those who don't. This is in-group bias at work, a psychological tendency to unconsciously prefer those who belong to our group, while being less fair or even hostile toward outsiders. It's an ancient survival mechanism. Early humans relied on close-knit tribes for protection, and anyone outside the group was a potential threat. Even today, we instinctively form these mental tribes, whether it's based on nationality, religion, workplace, or even something as trivial as preferring coffee over tea. The effects of in-group bias are everywhere. In politics, it leads to polarization, where people defend their party no matter what. In the workplace, it results in favoritism, where managers promote employees who remind them of themselves. Even in something as simple as customer service, studies show people are more helpful to those they perceive as similar. The most fascinating part: we rarely notice we're doing it. Breaking free from in-group bias requires a conscious effort to recognize it. The next time you catch yourself dismissing someone just because they're not part of your group, ask yourself, is this about their ideas, or just my instinctive reaction? The more we question our biases, the closer we get to thinking beyond the limits of our mental tribes. Outgroup homogeneity bias. At first glance, people from other groups always seem so similar. A rival school's students all dress the same. A different generation has identical opinions. Another culture appears to share a single mindset. But when looking at your own group, suddenly, the variety is obvious. Everyone has unique personalities, diverse opinions, and individual quirks. This is the outgroup homogeneity bias, the tendency to see members of other groups as more alike than they actually are, while recognizing diversity within your own group. Imagine a movie where the villains belong to a specific organization. They often seem like faceless copies, all driven by the same motivations. But the heroes? They have depth, different backstories, and distinct personalities. This bias plays out in real life too. A fan of one music genre might think all country songs sound the same, while appreciating the subtle differences in their own favorite style. A person from one city might assume all people from another city have the same attitude, despite clear differences among individuals. The problem with this bias is that it fuels stereotypes and misunderstandings. If outsiders seem interchangeable, it's easier to make broad generalizations about them, sometimes leading to unfair judgments, discrimination, or even conflict. Social scientists have found that this bias appears across cultures, affecting how people view race, nationality, political affiliations, and even workplace teams. The irony is that everyone is someone else's outgroup. The person you see as part of a monolithic them sees you the same way. But breaking the illusion is possible. The more you interact with people from different groups, the more you realize their individuality. The world isn't neatly divided into us and them. It's a vast collection of unique, complex individuals, each seeing the world through their own lens. Halo effect. Why do we assume that attractive people are smarter, kinder, or more capable, even when we have no evidence? Think about a celebrity you admire. Maybe they're charming in interviews, well-dressed, and always seem to say the right things. Now ask yourself, do you also assume they're a good person? That they'd make a great leader? That they're intelligent and kind? If so, you've just fallen for the halo effect, a psychological trick that causes one positive trait to influence our entire perception of a person. The halo effect makes us unconsciously associate good looks, confidence, or status with unrelated qualities like intelligence, honesty, or competence. This is why job applicants who dress sharply and speak eloquently are often judged as more capable than equally skilled candidates who lack those traits. It's why a charismatic politician can seem more trustworthy than a dull but honest one. It's also why teachers tend to assume that well-behaved students are smarter than troublemakers, even when their test scores say otherwise. One famous study by psychologist Edward Thorndike demonstrated this effect in the military. When officers were asked to rate their soldiers' abilities, they gave higher marks to those who looked more physically fit, even in areas completely unrelated to strength, like intelligence and leadership. The officers weren't doing this on purpose. Their brains simply filled in the blanks based on one strong impression. The halo effect can influence everything from hiring decisions to dating choices to courtroom verdicts. We assume someone who looks the part is the part, often without realizing it. But the next time you're drawn to someone for their charm, appearance, or confidence, take a moment to ask yourself, am I seeing the full picture, or just the glow of a halo? Because sometimes what shines on the surface isn't always what's beneath. Horn effect. Have you ever disliked someone the moment you met them, without really knowing why. Maybe their handshake was weak, their voice had an odd tone, or they wore a wrinkled shirt. Before they even spoke a full sentence, you had already made up your mind. I don't trust this person. This is the Horn effect in action, a psychological trick where one negative trait, no matter how small, unfairly taints our entire perception of someone. The Horn effect is the dark twin of the halo effect. Just as we assume that attractive, confident people are smarter and more capable, we also assume that someone with an undesirable trait, like a disheveled appearance, a nervous demeanor, or even an unfortunate name, is less competent or even less moral. A single negative impression spreads like a stain, coloring everything else about them. This bias plays out in everyday life more often than we realize. In job interviews, a candidate who stumbles over their words early on might be seen as unqualified, even if their resume is impressive. In schools, students labeled as troublemakers often find that their teachers view their mistakes as intentional, while well-liked students get the benefit of the doubt. Even in courtrooms, studies show that defendants who look untrustworthy, whether because of their facial expressions, posture, or even tattoos, are more likely to be judged harshly, regardless of the evidence. What makes the Horn effect so powerful is that it blinds us to reality. We think we're making rational judgments, but in truth, we're just reacting to a first impression. The next time you catch yourself dismissing someone too quickly, ask yourself, am I seeing the person or just the shadow of my own bias? Because sometimes the flaw isn't in them, it's in how we choose to look. Self-fulfilling prophecy. A student walks into a math test convinced they're going to fail. They don't even bother double-checking their answers, second-guess themselves on easy questions, and barely try on the hardest ones. When the results come back, their failing grade seems to confirm what they already knew. They're just bad at math. But was it really inevitable? Or did their belief shape the outcome? This psychological trick works like a cycle. A belief alters your actions affect the results, and the results reinforce the belief. It happens everywhere. Take the classic example of a teacher who subtly expects certain students to excel. They unconsciously give those students more attention, encouragement, and patience, which helps them perform better. Meanwhile, students who are expected to struggle might receive less enthusiasm and fewer opportunities to prove themselves. Over time, these differences accumulate, and the initial assumption becomes reality. It plays out in everyday life too. Someone who believes they're socially awkward might avoid eye contact, keep conversations short, and withdraw from interactions. Others, sensing their discomfort, respond with less warmth, reinforcing the idea that they're bad at socializing. On the flip side, confidence, real or not, often creates its own success. The dangerous part? Many of these cycles go unnoticed. People assume outcomes are proof of their original belief rather than a consequence of it. But if expectations can work against you, they can also work for you. The question isn't just what you think will happen, it's whether your belief is quietly shaping your reality. Better than average effect. Ask a group of people if they're better than average at driving, and the majority will say yes. Ask if they're more intelligent than average, and again, most will confidently agree. The same goes for kindness, honesty, and just about any other positive trait. Statistically, this doesn't add up. Half of all people must be below average, but thanks to the better than average effect, most of us refuse to believe that we might be just okay at something. This psychological trick is a mix of ego and selective memory. When evaluating ourselves, we tend to focus on our best moments while conveniently overlooking our failures. A person who cuts someone off in traffic might excuse it as a one-time mistake, while remembering every reckless driver they've ever encountered as proof that they are superior behind the wheel. The better than average effect thrives in areas where skills are subjective or difficult to measure. Everyone likes to believe they have a great sense of humor, but what does that actually mean? Since there's no clear benchmark, we assume our strengths make us exceptional while dismissing our weaknesses as minor flaws. While a little self-confidence is healthy, this illusion can be dangerous. Overestimating abilities can lead to bad decisions. Students underestimate how much they need to study. Investors believe they can outsmart the market, and people take risks they aren't prepared for. But here's the real kicker. The people who truly excel at something are often less affected by this bias. They recognize their limitations and work to improve, while those who think they're already above average remain stuck where they are. Maybe the real secret to being better than average is realizing that you're probably not. Worse than average effect. Suppose you're faced with a situation where you're handed a Rubik's Cube and asked to solve it. You might immediately assume you'd be terrible at it, picturing only expert speed cubers who can finish in seconds. Or maybe someone asks you to parallel park in front of a crowd. Suddenly, you feel like the least competent driver in the world. But here's the twist. You might not actually be as bad as you think. This is the worse than average effect, a psychological trick that makes people underestimate their own abilities, especially when it comes to skills they perceive as difficult. Unlike the better than average effect, which inflates confidence, this bias kicks in when we assume most other people are more skilled than we are, often without evidence. The illusion is strongest in areas where expertise seems exclusive. If a skill is highly visible, like playing the piano, doing complex math, or public speaking, our minds focus on the professionals who dominate that field. We rarely think about the countless average or below average performers because they don't stand out. This distorted perspective makes us feel like we're uniquely unqualified, when in reality, we might be just as capable as everyone else. Ironically, this effect can hold people back from even trying. Someone who assumes they're terrible at chess might never play, while another who believes they can't dance might avoid the floor entirely. The result? They never give themselves the chance to improve. The truth is, most people are neither exceptional nor awful at most things. They're just average. And in a world where self-doubt can be as misleading as overconfidence, the real mistake might be believing you're worse than you actually are. Lake Wobegon effect. In a nationwide survey, a staggering 80% of drivers rated themselves as above average behind the wheel. Mathematically, that's impossible. Half of all drivers should be below average. And yet, this illusion of superiority isn't limited to driving. People tend to believe they're smarter, more skilled, and even kinder than most. This is the Lake Wobegon effect, a cognitive bias where individuals overestimate their own abilities compared to others. Named after the fictional town of Lake Wobegon, where all the children are above average. This effect makes us believe we're exceptional, even when we're just average. It's why students often predict they'll score higher on tests than they do. It's why most employees think they're more competent than their peers. And it's why nearly everyone assumes they have a better than average sense of humor. The Lake Wobegon effect is fueled by selective memory and self-serving bias. We remember our successes more vividly than our failures, making us feel more accomplished than we actually are. Meanwhile, when we compare ourselves to others, we often judge them based on their worst moments, while viewing ourselves in the best possible light. This illusion isn't entirely bad. It can boost confidence and motivation, but it can also lead to arrogance, poor decision-making, and an unwillingness to improve. If everyone assumes they're already above average, what's the incentive to grow? True self-awareness comes from embracing the uncomfortable truth. Being average isn't an insult, it's a statistical reality. The real question is, what are you going to do about it? Survivorship bias. During World War II, the US military faced a crucial question. Where should they reinforce their planes to reduce losses? They studied returning aircraft, marking bullet holes in the most frequently hit areas. The logical move seemed obvious: add armor to those spots. But then, a statistician named Abraham Wald pointed out a flaw in their thinking. The planes they were analyzing were the ones that made it back. The ones that didn't return, those hit in other, more vulnerable places, weren't part of the data. Instead of reinforcing where the bullet holes were, they needed to reinforce where they weren't. This is survivorship bias, the mistake of focusing only on successful cases while ignoring the ones that failed. It's everywhere in life. We see it when we read about billionaires who dropped out of college, thinking that skipping school might be the secret to success, forgetting the countless others who did the same and failed. We hear it in fitness advice when people swear by extreme workouts, never considering the ones who burned out or got injured along the way. Even in business, we admire companies that didn't give up, while ignoring the thousands of others that persisted just as hard but still went bankrupt. This bias tricks us into seeing only the winners, distorting reality and making success seem more predictable than it actually is. It's easy to believe that following the habits of the rich and famous will get you the same results. But the truth is, for every visible success, there are countless invisible failures. The key isn't just to learn from those who made it, it's to study those who didn't. Because sometimes, the real lessons aren't in the ones who survived, but in the ones we never hear about. Base rate fallacy. Imagine you go to the doctor for a rare disease that affects only 1 in 10,000 people. The doctor gives you a test that's 99% accurate, meaning it correctly identifies sick patients 99% of the time, and correctly identifies healthy people 99% of the time. Your result comes back positive. Panic sets in. A 99% accurate test means you're almost certainly sick, right? Not necessarily. This is where most people fall into the base rate fallacy, ignoring how rare the disease actually is. Let's break it down. Out of 10,000 people, only 1 will truly have the disease. But since the test is 99% accurate, it will still mistakenly label about 100 healthy people as positive. That means out of all the positive results, only 1 person actually has the disease, while 100 don't. Your true odds of being sick? About 1 in 101, or just 1%. This mistake happens everywhere. People hear that a personality test is 90% accurate and assume it must describe them perfectly, forgetting that broad statements can apply to almost anyone. A security system detects criminals 95% of the time, but if the crime rate is extremely low, most of those criminals are actually false alarms. Even in job hiring, someone might seem like the perfect candidate based on a rare skill set. But if very few people with that skill actually succeed in the role, betting on them might be riskier than it seems. The base rate fallacy shows why intuition can fail us. Our brains love simple answers. Positive test means sick, elite degree means success. But reality is messier. Numbers only tell part of the story. And without considering the bigger picture, we can end up making decisions that feel logical but are completely wrong. Prosecutor's fallacy. What would you do if you're on a jury for a high-profile murder case? The prosecutor confidently presents DNA evidence. A sample found at the crime scene matches the defendant, and the odds of a random person having the same DNA profile are just 1 in a million. With odds this low, the prosecutor argues, there's virtually no chance he's innocent. The jury nods. The number is overwhelming. But is it actually proof? Not quite. This is a classic case of the prosecutor's fallacy, confusing the probability of the evidence if the suspect is innocent with the probability that the suspect is innocent. A 1 in a million chance of a random match doesn't mean there's a 1 in a million chance the defendant is innocent. If the city has 10 million people, that means about 10 people would randomly match the DNA. The defendant could just be one of those unlucky few. This mistake isn't just made in courtrooms. It happens in security screenings, medical testing, and even everyday arguments. A lie detector might be 90% accurate, but if thousands of innocent people take the test, plenty will be falsely labeled as liars. A terrorism watch list might have a 99% accuracy rate, but in a country of millions, the false positives can vastly outnumber the real threats. Numbers feel persuasive, especially when they come from experts, but probabilities can be misleading without context. The next time you hear a statistic being used as undeniable proof, ask yourself, is this number really saying what they think it's saying? Because sometimes what looks like certainty is just a trick of perception. Conjunction fallacy. Meet Sarah. She's passionate about social justice, highly intelligent, and was deeply involved in activism during college. Now imagine you're given two choices. A. Sarah is a bank teller. B. Sarah is a bank teller and is active in the feminist movement. Which seems more likely? Most people instinctively choose option B. It just feels right. Sarah's description makes her sound like someone who would be involved in activism. But here's the trick. Option B cannot be more likely than option A. Why? Because every feminist bank teller is, by definition, also a bank teller. Adding extra details always makes a scenario seem more plausible, but in reality it makes it less probable. This is the conjunction fallacy in action. This mental slip happens because our brains love a good story. Specific details make a narrative feel real, even when they make it statistically weaker. Think about true crime cases. People often assume a suspect is more likely to be guilty if they also have a history of violence, even when the basic probability of them committing that particular crime doesn't actually change. Marketing, politics, and media take full advantage of this bias. A vague statement like, "this supplement boosts immunity," doesn't sound as persuasive as, "this supplement boosts immunity and helps fight colds." But by adding more detail, it's actually making a bolder and less likely claim. The next time you hear an argument packed with extra details that sound too convincing, take a step back. The more specific a claim gets, the more chances it has to be wrong. Reality is rarely as neat and tidy as a good story. Disjunction fallacy. Think about a moment when you're at the airport, anxiously waiting for your flight. You check the weather, clear skies. You check the airline website, no reported delays. You check the news, nothing unusual. Confident that everything looks fine, you assume your flight must be on time. Then, the dreaded announcement comes. Flight 308 has been delayed. What happened? You fell into a classic reasoning trap. Just because none of the individual delay factors seemed likely, you assumed that a delay overall was unlikely. But in reality, there are countless reasons a flight could be late. Weather, maintenance, air traffic, crew issues, security concerns. Even if each individual cause is unlikely, the probability that at least one of them happens is actually quite high. This is the disjunction fallacy, the tendency to underestimate the likelihood of an event that can occur in multiple ways. It's the opposite of the conjunction fallacy. Instead of overestimating the probability of a specific scenario, we underestimate the probability of something happening when there are many possible ways it could occur. It shows up everywhere. A student assumes they won't fail a test, because failing requires either making too many careless mistakes, or forgetting key concepts, or running out of time. Since none of these seem likely alone, they assume failing is unlikely until it happens. Even in decision-making, this bias tricks people into taking risks they shouldn't. A gambler might think the odds of losing big are low because going broke requires either a bad streak or poor strategy or bad luck. But when all those small risks add up, the result is inevitable. The mind naturally struggles with probabilities, but understanding this fallacy can be a game changer. The next time you assume something won't happen, ask yourself, how many different ways could it happen? You might be surprised at the answer. Monty Hall problem misconception. You're on a game show standing in front of 3 doors. Behind one is a brand new car. Behind the other 2, goats. You pick a door, let's say door 1. Before revealing what's behind it, the host, who knows where the car is, opens another door, let's say door 3, which has a goat. Now, you're given a choice. Stick with door 1 or switch to door 2. It feels like it doesn't matter, right? There are 2 doors left, so the car should have a 50-50 chance of being behind either one. But here's where intuition betrays us. The best move? Always switch. At the start, you had a 1 in 3 chance of picking the car and a 2 in 3 chance of picking a goat. That hasn't changed. If your first choice was wrong, which happens 2 out of 3 times, the remaining door must have the car. By switching, you win 2/3 of the time. But the misconception that it's a coin flip is hard to shake. Even trained mathematicians have struggled with it. Our brains instinctively simplify probabilities, treating the final choice as a fresh 50-50, instead of considering how the odds were set up from the beginning. This misjudgment isn't just about game shows. It reflects how we resist counterintuitive truths. We rely on gut instincts that feel right, but fail under scrutiny. Whether it's investing, decision-making, or even everyday choices, understanding how probabilities really work can help us avoid costly mistakes. So the next time a choice seems like pure chance, take a step back. The right move might not be what your intuition tells you, but what the numbers do. Benford's law skepticism. You're in a situation where you're handed a thick stack of financial records and asked to check for fraud. Where do you even begin? Strangely enough, one of the most powerful tools isn't a complicated algorithm. It's the simple act of counting how often numbers start with 1, 2, or 9. And according to Benford's law, in most naturally occurring datasets, lower digits appear far more often as the leading number than higher ones. That sounds bizarre, right? Why wouldn't the digits 1 through 9 appear roughly equally? That's exactly what skeptics of Benford's law struggle with. Our brains love symmetry, uniformity, and fair distributions. The idea that numbers don't behave in a way that feels logical triggers immediate doubt. But the numbers don't care about our intuition. Benford's law applies to datasets that span multiple orders of magnitude, things like populations, stock prices, and even lengths of rivers. If a number grows exponentially, there's a much higher chance of it beginning with 1 rather than 9. The law is so reliable that forensic accountants and tax auditors use it to catch fraud. When people fake numbers, they tend to spread digits more evenly than reality does. Still, skepticism lingers. Some believe it's just a mathematical curiosity, applicable in some cases but not a universal truth. And to be fair, Benford's law isn't foolproof. Data sets that are constrained, like lottery numbers or phone numbers, don't follow it. But dismissing it outright ignores its eerie accuracy in so many real-world cases. The real lesson? Sometimes reality is weirder than intuition. We trust our gut to tell us how numbers should behave, but the patterns that emerge in the chaos of life often defy our expectations. And the more we question those expectations, the closer we get to understanding the hidden structures shaping the world around us. Hot hand fallacy. You're watching a basketball game and one player is on fire. He's made 5 shots in a row and the crowd is buzzing. The next time he gets the ball, you just know it's going in. He's in the zone, right? Well, maybe not. This belief that a player who has made several shots in a row is more likely to make the next one is called the hot hand fallacy. It's the idea that success breeds success, that streaks have momentum, and that a player can temporarily become untouchable. The problem? In most cases, it's just an illusion. Statisticians studying basketball found that a player's chance of making a shot doesn't actually increase after a streak of hits. Each shot is still a separate event, influenced by skill, shot selection, and defense, but not by some mystical hot streak. The ball doesn't remember the last 5 shots. This fallacy extends beyond sports. Investors fall for it when they assume a stock that's been rising will keep rising just because it has momentum. Gamblers believe a winning streak means they're in the zone and keep betting big, only to watch their luck evaporate. Even in everyday life, people assume that someone who's been succeeding repeatedly, whether in business, relationships, or creativity, will continue to do so indefinitely. But here's the twist. While the hot hand itself is mostly an illusion, confidence is very real. A player who believes in their streak might take riskier shots, feeling invincible. A trader riding a winning streak might invest more boldly. In this way, the belief in the hot hand can sometimes create the effect, at least for a little while. So next time you find yourself convinced that momentum guarantees success, take a step back. Are you seeing a real pattern or just another trick of the mind? Gambler's conceit. You sit at the blackjack table, gripping your last stack of chips. You've been on a brutal losing streak, but it doesn't matter. You tell yourself that this will be your last bet. You'll walk away right after this hand. Then you lose. But quitting now would mean accepting the loss, so you place another bet. Just one more. This is the gambler's conceit, the illusion that you'll stop gambling when you plan to, even as you continue making reckless decisions. People trapped in this mindset believe they'll quit right after the next win, but that win only pulls them back in. Every victory feels like momentum, every loss feels like unfinished business, and suddenly there's no clear stopping point. It's not just gamblers who fall for this trap. Investors convince themselves they'll sell their stocks before the market crashes, until greed convinces them to hold on just a little longer. A procrastinator promises to stop scrolling social media after one more video, only to find an hour has vanished. Even binge watchers tell themselves they'll stop after one last episode, but the next cliffhanger keeps them glued to the screen. The problem is that just one more never feels like the final one. It always seems like stopping later will be easier than stopping now. But later keeps moving further away. So, the next time you tell yourself you'll stop soon, ask, will you really? Or is the promise of quitting just another way of keeping yourself hooked? Gambler's fallacy. A coin flips through the air. Heads. Again. Heads. And again. Heads. By the fourth toss, something inside insists. Tails has to come next. It feels inevitable, like the universe must balance itself out. But that feeling, it's a trap. The gambler's fallacy tricks people into believing that past outcomes affect future probabilities, even when events are completely independent. In a fair coin toss, heads or tails is always a 50-50 chance no matter what happened before. Yet, in casinos, sports betting, and everyday decision-making, this illusion leads people astray. Consider a roulette wheel. A gambler watches as red comes up 5 times in a row. Convinced that black is due, they push all their chips forward, only to watch the wheel land on red again. The truth is, the odds haven't changed. Each spin is independent of the last. The wheel has no memory. This fallacy isn't just a gambler's problem. It sneaks into daily life in subtle ways. A student who's been lucky on multiple choice tests starts second-guessing answers, thinking, I've picked C 3 times in a row. It can't be C again. A couple trying for a baby assumes that after 3 boys, a girl is inevitable. A job seeker believes that after countless rejections, the next interview must go well. But randomness doesn't work that way. Probability doesn't owe anyone a win. The universe isn't keeping score. Understanding this can save money at the casino, prevent bad decisions, and teach an important lesson. Luck is just that. Luck. The best way to win isn't to chase patterns that don't exist. It's to recognize when the mind is playing tricks and let the coin fall where it may. Regression fallacy. A golfer has the worst game of his life. Every swing feels off, every putt misses. Frustrated, he books a lesson with an instructor. The next time he plays, he does much better. Naturally, he credits the lesson for his improvement. But was it really the lesson? Or was he just experiencing something inevitable? The regression fallacy happens when people mistake natural fluctuations for meaningful cause and effect relationships. In reality, extreme events, whether unusually bad or unusually good, tend to be followed by more average ones, simply due to chance. A terrible golf game is often followed by a better one, not because of a quick fix solution, but because performance naturally evens out over time. This illusion pops up everywhere. A parent scolds their child for getting a bad grade, only to see improvement on the next test and assume their strictness worked. A coach benches a star player after a rough game, and when they perform better the next time, it seems like the benching helped. A company hires a consultant after a terrible quarter, and when profits bounce back to normal, they assume the consultant was a genius. But in all these cases, performance was likely going to return to the average anyway, whether or not any action was taken. Recognizing this fallacy is crucial because it can lead to wasted effort, misplaced credit, and bad decision-making. Not everything needs a cause. Sometimes things just fluctuate. The real skill isn't in reacting to every up and down, but in knowing when to step back and let time do its thing. Law of small numbers. Something strange happens when you flip a coin 5 times and it lands on heads 4 times. Would you assume the coin is biased? Many people would, even though 5 flips are nowhere near enough to reveal a true pattern. This is the law of small numbers in action, the tendency to draw big conclusions from tiny samples. People crave patterns, even when there aren't enough data points to justify them. Imagine a new restaurant opens in town, and you hear 2 bad reviews from friends. You conclude the place is terrible, despite hundreds of other customers who may have had great experiences. Or consider an investor who buys stock in a company because the price jumped twice in a row, believing it's a guaranteed winner. In reality, short-term fluctuations mean very little, but the brain rushes to see trends where none exist. This fallacy is everywhere. In sports, a player might hit 3 game-winning shots, and suddenly they're hailed as a clutch performer, despite years of average statistics. In medicine, a handful of people report miraculous results from an untested treatment, leading others to believe it must work, even when scientific trials say otherwise. Even in crime reports, a short-term spike in incidents can make people believe their city is getting more dangerous, even if long-term trends show the opposite. The irony is that the law of small numbers makes us feel more certain when we should actually be more skeptical. The fewer examples we have, the more cautious we should be. But our minds instinctively do the opposite. Next time you hear an extraordinary claim based on just a few examples, ask yourself, is this real insight or just a trick of a too small sample? Mean reversion fallacy. A struggling writer finally lands a best-selling novel. Critics hail them as a literary genius. Fans expect their next book to be just as great, and publishers throw huge advances their way. But when the next book releases, it performs only moderately well. Suddenly, people claim the writer has lost their touch. But have they really? Or was their initial success just an extreme event bound to be followed by something more average? This is the mean reversion fallacy, the mistaken belief that extreme success or failure will continue, rather than naturally returning to the average. It happens in all areas of life. A stock that skyrockets one day is often expected to keep climbing, but it usually settles back to a more stable level. A struggling athlete who has one incredible game might be hailed as a rising star, only to perform normally in the next match. In reality, neither the success nor the failure was permanent. It was just a statistical fluctuation. The fallacy tricks people into seeing patterns where there are none. If a student scores way higher than usual on a test, they might assume they've suddenly become brilliant, until their next test brings them back to their average. A new business that takes off in its first few months might mistakenly believe that rapid growth will never slow down. When it does, they panic, thinking they've done something wrong, when in reality, they were just returning to normal. Understanding the mean reversion fallacy helps us avoid overreacting to temporary highs and lows. Instead of assuming a single event defines the future, we should step back and look at the bigger picture. After all, success and failure are rarely permanent. Most things, given enough time, settle back to where they naturally belong. Clustering illusions. You're flipping a coin, and something strange happens. It lands on heads 5 times in a row. That feels impossible, right? It must be rigged, or maybe something unusual is going on. But here's the truth. It's just randomness playing tricks on you. This is the clustering illusion, our tendency to see patterns in random data. Our brains are wired to look for structure, so when we see a bunch of similar outcomes grouped together, we assume there must be a deeper meaning. But in reality, randomness is messy, and streaks are just part of the chaos. Imagine you're looking at a battlefield map from World War II, showing where bombs landed in London. Some areas were hit repeatedly, while others remained untouched. At the time, people thought the clustering of bombs had to mean something. Maybe the enemy had inside knowledge, or was deliberately targeting certain zones. But later, analysis showed the distribution was completely random. The clusters weren't evidence of a strategy. They were just what randomness looks like. The same illusion appears in everyday life. Gamblers believe slot machines are due for a payout after a long losing streak. People think crime must be increasing if a few high-profile incidents happen close together. Investors panic when a few bad days in the stock market make it feel like a crash is inevitable. In all these cases, randomness is being mistaken for a meaningful pattern. So the next time you see a streak, good or bad, pause for a moment. Is it a real trend, or just a cluster of coincidences? Our minds crave order, but the universe often has other plans. Selection bias. Try to picture yourself scrolling through social media, and every entrepreneur you see is a millionaire in their 20s. It starts to feel like everyone who starts a business becomes wildly successful. But is that really the case? Or are you just seeing the winners while the countless failures remain invisible? This is selection bias, when the information we see is filtered in a way that skews our perception of reality. We only hear about the people who made it big, not the ones who struggled for years and failed. The result? We assume success is easier or more common than it actually is. It's everywhere. In history books, we read about great leaders and their genius strategies, but what about the ones who tried similar things and failed? When researching medical treatments, studies that show positive results are more likely to be published than those with no effect, creating an illusion that a drug is more effective than it really is. Even in war, militaries once reinforced planes based on where they took the most damage, until they realized they were only looking at the ones that made it back, the real weak spots, on the planes that never returned. Selection bias distorts our judgment because it tricks us into thinking we're seeing the full picture when we're only getting a curated slice. The key to avoiding it? Ask, what's missing? Because the truth isn't just in the stories we hear, it's often in the ones that never get told. Sampling bias. Most people don't notice this, but you're watching a street interview where people are asked, "Do you trust the government?" The responses are overwhelmingly negative. Everyone interviewed seems to believe politicians are corrupt and incompetent. You start thinking, wow, everyone must feel this way. But here's the catch. The interviewer only approached people outside a protest. The sample was never random, so the conclusion is misleading. This is sampling bias in action. The mistake of drawing conclusions from a non-representative group. It happens all the time, often without anyone realizing. Political polls that only survey landline users, product reviews based on vocal customers, while satisfied ones stay silent, and even medical studies that focus on one demographic while ignoring others. All of these skew the results and paint a distorted picture of reality. A classic example comes from World War II. The US military wanted to reinforce bomber planes based on where they took the most bullet holes. The problem? They were only analyzing planes that made it back. The ones that got shot down weren't included in the sample, meaning the real weak spots were likely in areas without bullet holes, the places where damage was fatal. Fortunately, statistician Abraham Wald spotted this bias and saved countless lives by suggesting reinforcement in the areas where returning planes showed no damage. The danger of sampling bias is that it tricks us into thinking we see the full picture when, in reality, we're looking at a curated version of the truth. The loudest voices, the easiest to reach data, the most convenient examples, these don't always reflect reality. Next time you hear a statistic or poll, ask yourself, who was left out? Because sometimes, the most important part of the story is the part you don't see. Observer bias. A scientist is observing a group of children in a classroom, trying to determine whether boys or girls are more likely to interrupt the teacher. She watches closely, scribbling notes every time a child speaks out of turn. But without realizing it, she expects boys to interrupt more. So she notices their interruptions more often, while the same behavior from girls blends into the background. Her conclusion? Boys are the troublemakers. The reality? Her expectations shaped what she saw. This is observer bias, the tendency for our beliefs, expectations, and personal experiences to influence what we perceive. It happens in science, journalism, police investigations, and even everyday life. A doctor who thinks a patient is exaggerating symptoms might unconsciously dismiss real signs of illness. A boss who believes an employee is lazy might overlook moments of hard work. A sports referee who expects a certain team to play dirty might call more fouls against them. One of the most famous examples comes from medical studies. In the past, researchers often believed men and women experienced pain differently. When conducting experiments, they tended to notice and record male patients' pain more accurately while dismissing or downplaying female patients' complaints. This distorted the results, influencing treatments and medical advice for years. The tricky part about observer bias is that it feels like reality. After all, if you saw it with your own eyes, how could it not be true? But human perception isn't a passive recording. It's a filter, shaped by everything we already believe. The next time you're convinced something is obvious, ask yourself, am I seeing things as they are, or as I expect them to be? Because sometimes, the hardest thing to notice is the bias behind our own eyes. Experimenter's bias. A scientist runs an experiment to test a new painkiller. The results look promising. Patients who received the drug reported significantly less pain. But something doesn't sit right. The control group, who got a placebo, also improved. Just not as much. Could it be the drug, or was something else at play? This is where experimenter's bias sneaks in. It happens when researchers unintentionally influence the outcome of their studies, often without realizing it. Maybe they subconsciously gave more encouragement to the test group, or perhaps the way they phrased their questions led patients to report lower pain levels. Even tiny changes in tone, body language, or wording can skew results. One of the most famous cases happened in the early 1900s with Clever Hans, a horse supposedly capable of doing math. He could tap his hoof the correct number of times when asked a problem. But it wasn't that Hans understood numbers. He was just reading subtle, unconscious cues from his trainer. When the trainer knew the answer, Hans got it right. When the trainer didn't, the horse's genius disappeared. The same effect occurs in scientific research. If a researcher expects a drug to work, they might unintentionally interpret ambiguous data in its favor. If they think a student is gifted, they might offer more praise and opportunities, reinforcing that belief. It's not fraud, it's just human nature. That's why double-blind studies, where neither researchers nor participants know who's in the test group, are crucial. They help eliminate these biases, ensuring results reflect reality, not expectations. Next time you hear about a groundbreaking study, ask yourself, did they account for the invisible hand of expectation? Because sometimes, belief shapes results more than the truth itself. Response bias. A restaurant manager sends out a survey asking customers if they enjoyed their meal. Most of the responses are glowing. Great food, excellent service, would definitely return. But something is missing. Where are the complaints? This is response bias in action. It happens when the way a question is asked, or the situation in which it's asked, nudges people toward a particular answer. Maybe customers didn't want to be rude, so they said they loved the meal when in reality, they just didn't want to make a scene. Maybe only the happiest diners bothered to fill out the survey, while the unsatisfied ones simply walked away, never to return. It's the same reason political polls, customer reviews, and even job satisfaction surveys can be misleading. People don't always tell the truth, not because they want to deceive, but because they want to be socially acceptable, polite, or agreeable. If you're asked, "Do you support this charity?" you might say yes, even if you don't, just to avoid looking heartless. If a doctor asks how often you exercise, you might stretch the truth a little to sound healthier. The problem: decisions get made based on bad data. A company thinks their employees are happy when, in reality, people are afraid to complain. A politician believes they have widespread support when, in fact, people just didn't want to argue. A business assumes their customers love a product when most of them were just too polite to say otherwise. If you really want to understand what people think, don't just trust the answers. Look at how the questions were asked. Who was willing to respond, and who stayed silent? Because sometimes the most important voices are the ones that never speak up at all. Social desirability bias. A job interview is going well until the interviewer asks, "How often do you procrastinate?" You hesitate. The real answer: probably more than you should. But you know what they want to hear, so you force a confident smile and say, "Oh, I'm always ahead of schedule." This is social desirability bias, the tendency to give answers that make us look good rather than ones that reflect reality. It happens all the time. When asked how often we exercise, we exaggerate. When filling out a survey on recycling, we claim we do it religiously, even if our trash can tells a different story. When a doctor asks about our diet, suddenly that fast food binge doesn't seem worth mentioning. This bias warps research, statistics, and even personal relationships. If a politician asks a crowd, "Who here votes in every election?" most hands will shoot up, even if some of those people rarely set foot in a voting booth. Dating profiles, packed with people who love reading but haven't finished a book in years. And workplace feedback? Employees tell their bosses what they think they want to hear, not what they actually feel. It's not that people are intentionally lying, they're just answering in a way that avoids judgment. We all want to be seen as good, responsible, and admirable, even if reality is messier than that. But here's the catch. When everyone polishes their image, it distorts the truth. Businesses make bad decisions based on misleading data. Society assumes problems aren't as bad as they are. And on a personal level, we risk fooling even ourselves. Because if you tell a perfect version of your life for long enough, you might just start believing it. Pareidolic illusions. You're walking alone at night when you glance at a tree and freeze. A shadowy face is staring back at you. Your heart pounds until you take a second look. It's just a knot in the bark. This is pareidolia, the brain's tendency to see familiar patterns, especially faces, where none exist. It's why we spot animals in clouds, a man on the moon, or even Jesus on a piece of toast. The mind is wired to make sense of chaos, and when given incomplete information, it fills in the gaps with what it expects to see. Pareidolic illusions go beyond harmless fun. They tap into a deep survival mechanism. Our ancestors had to detect faces quickly, whether it was a friend, a foe, or a lurking predator. Mistaking a bush for a tiger is embarrassing, but mistaking a tiger for a bush is fatal. That bias for overdetection stayed with us, which is why we still see faces in car headlights or hear hidden messages when songs are played backward. But it's not just about faces. Entire belief systems have been influenced by pareidolia. People have claimed to see divine images in food, ghosts in blurry photos, or UFOs in strange cloud formations. The mind craves meaning even in randomness. Once you notice pareidolia, you can't unsee it. Every stain, smudge, or oddly shaped rock starts looking like something more. It's a reminder that reality isn't just what's in front of us, it's what our brains interpret it to be. And sometimes, our minds are a little too eager to find meaning in the meaningless. Apophenia. You flip a coin 5 times, heads, 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 heads. It feels impossible, like the universe is trying to tell you something. Maybe the coin is rigged, maybe it's a sign, or maybe it's just random chance. This is apophenia, the brain's tendency to see patterns and connections in meaningless data. It's why people find secret messages in song lyrics, link unrelated events as part of a conspiracy, or feel like the universe is giving them signs. Our minds are wired to search for meaning, even when there isn't any. This ability helped our ancestors survive. Spotting a pattern, like rustling bushes often meaning danger, could mean the difference between life and death. But in today's world, this instinct misfires. People see faces in the clouds, assume 2 bad things happening in a row means a curse, or believe a lucky jersey helped their team win. Casinos and psychics thrive on apophenia, making people believe in hot streaks, lucky numbers, and hidden forces at play. One of the most famous cases of apophenia is the Bible code theory, where people claim to find hidden messages predicting historical events in the Bible. But when the same technique was applied to Moby Dick, it also predicted real-life assassinations. The patterns weren't real. They were just coincidences. Our brains are powerful, but they're not perfect. Recognizing apophenia can help us separate real insights from illusions. The next time you notice a strange coincidence or feel like the universe is sending a message, take a step back. Is it truly meaningful, or just your mind connecting dots that were never meant to be connected? Illusory correlation. Every time you forget your umbrella, it seems to rain. But when you remember to bring it, nothing but sunshine. It's almost like the universe is messing with you. This is an example of illusory correlation, when people perceive a relationship between 2 things that don't actually have one. It happens because our brains love to connect dots, even when the pattern isn't real. Take another classic example, full moons and strange behavior. Many people swear that hospitals, police stations, and even pets go wild when the moon is full. But studies have shown no actual increase in emergency room visits, crime, or odd behavior on those nights. So why does the myth persist? Because when something weird happens on a full moon, people remember it. But when it happens on any other night, they forget. The mind holds onto the proof that fits the pattern and ignores the rest. Illusory correlations can lead to stereotypes, superstitions, and bad decisions. Imagine a person meets 2 rude individuals from the same city. Their brain forms a false connection. People from that city are rude. In reality, those 2 people were just rude, not the entire city. But once the pattern is in place, confirmation bias kicks in, reinforcing the false belief. Understanding illusory correlation can help us think more critically. Next time you catch yourself making a connection between 2 things, ask, is this real, or am I just noticing what I want to see? Because sometimes the universe isn't playing tricks on you, your brain is. Intuitive attribution. You're walking down the street when a driver speeds past, cutting off another car. Instantly, you think, what a reckless idiot. But when you're the one running late, weaving through traffic, you justify it. I had no choice. It was an emergency. This is how the mind plays tricks on us. When judging others, we assume their actions reveal their character. Selfish, careless, rude. But when we make the same mistakes, we blame the situation. Stress, bad luck, a misunderstanding. This snap judgment is so automatic, we rarely stop to question it. In daily life, this shortcut can create misunderstandings. A coworker misses a deadline. Must be lazy. A friend forgets to text back. Clearly they don't care. But when we're in those same positions, we're overflowing with justifications. The reality is, people's actions are often shaped by external factors we can't see. Stress, exhaustion, personal struggles. This mental habit isn't all bad. It helps us navigate the world without overanalyzing everything. But it also distorts our perception, making us harsher on others than we are on ourselves. Next time you catch yourself labeling someone's actions as a reflection of who they are, pause. Consider what you'd tell yourself if the roles were reversed. The truth is, most people aren't villains or heroes. They're just navigating their own unseen battles, much like you. Intuition over analysis. A friend invites you to a poker game. You've never played seriously before, but halfway through the night, you start making bold bets, somehow knowing when to fold and when to go all in. You can't explain why, but your gut keeps leading you in the right direction. This is what happens when instinct takes over before analysis has a chance. Sometimes the brain picks up on patterns before we're consciously aware of them. It's why an experienced firefighter can sense something is wrong in a burning building before seeing any obvious danger, or why a doctor can diagnose a rare condition in seconds without running endless tests. These snap judgments feel like magic, but they're built on experience, past exposure, and subtle cues our brain processes without us realizing. The trouble is, intuition isn't always right. A hiring manager may have a good feeling about one candidate over another, even if their qualifications don't match. A gambler might keep betting on a winning streak, convinced they've cracked the code, only to lose everything. While intuition can be powerful, it's not infallible. It operates on patterns, and sometimes those patterns are misleading. There's a balance between trusting your gut and thinking things through. When a situation is familiar, intuition can be a lifesaver. But when the stakes are high and emotions are involved, slowing down and questioning that instinct can make all the difference. A quick decision feels good, but a well-reasoned one lasts longer. Loss aversion. You're at an auction, holding your paddle tight, heart racing. The bid for a fancy dinner experience is at $100, but you've already invested time and excitement. You raise your hand, $120. Someone counters. You go up again. Before you know it, you've bid $250, far more than the dinner is worth. But stopping now would mean accepting a loss, and that just feels worse than overpaying. This tendency to throw more money, time, or effort into something, just because you've already invested in it, is a trap people fall into all the time. Movie halfway through and you hate it. You stay because you already sat through an hour. A failing business venture. You keep pouring money into it, convinced that quitting would mean wasting what you've already spent. Bad relationship. You hold on thinking about the years you've invested, even when you're miserable. It's easy to see why this happens. Our brains treat the past investment as a justification for continuing, even when the smarter choice would be to cut our losses. The rational decision would be to ask, what's best for me moving forward? Instead of thinking, I can't waste what I already put in. But in reality, the past is gone. It can't be recovered. The best way to escape this mindset is to recognize that the resources you've already spent, time, money, effort, are sunk. The real question is, would I still make this choice if I hadn't already invested in? Risk aversion. Consider this for a moment. Someone offers you a choice. Take a guaranteed $50 right now or flip a coin. Heads, you get $100. Tails, you get nothing. Most people take the sure $50, even though mathematically, both options have the same expected value. Why? Because losing feels worse than winning feels good. This tendency to prefer certainty over potential gain, even when the risk is reasonable, is at the core of how people make decisions. It's why many hesitate to invest in the stock market, start a new business, or even try a new restaurant. The potential for loss looms larger in our minds than the possibility of gain. Risk aversion isn't always irrational. It can be a useful survival instinct. Early humans who took unnecessary risks were less likely to pass on their genes. But in today's world, this instinct often holds us back. A student might stick to easy classes instead of challenging themselves, fearing a lower grade. A professional might turn down a career-changing opportunity because it's outside their comfort zone. Even in social situations, people avoid speaking up because of the risk of embarrassment, even when the potential rewards, connections, opportunities, personal growth are far greater. But the irony is, avoiding risks can be the riskiest choice of all. Playing it safe can lead to stagnation, missed opportunities, and regret. The next time you find yourself hesitating because something might go wrong, ask yourself, what's the real danger? Sometimes the biggest loss isn't taking the risk, it's never taking it at all. Risk-seeking. You're down to your last $100 in a casino. You could walk away with what little you have left, or go all in on one final bet. Logic says you should keep the money, but something inside pushes you to risk it all. Why? Because when people feel like they're losing, they don't just become cautious, they sometimes do the opposite, taking even bigger risks to try to win it all back. Risk-seeking behavior is most common when people are facing losses. A gambler who's down big keeps betting recklessly, convinced they can turn it around. An investor whose stocks have plummeted refuses to sell, instead doubling down on a losing bet. A student who procrastinated all semester suddenly takes wild chances on an all-night cram session instead of a steady study plan. The psychology behind this is simple. Losses hurt, and the more we lose, the more desperate we are to erase the damage. But here's the catch. This mindset often makes things worse. The gambler loses everything, the investor sinks deeper, and the student burns out before the exam even begins. While risk can sometimes lead to success, chasing losses rarely ends well. That's not to say taking risks is always bad. Some of the greatest achievements in history happened because people ignored the safe path. But there's a difference between a calculated risk and a desperate one. The key isn't to avoid risk altogether. It's knowing when you're taking a bold step forward and when you're just swinging wildly, hoping for a miracle. Framing of risk. Let's say you're in a scenario where your doctor tells you about a new surgery. There's a 90% chance of survival. Sounds good, right? But what if they said there's a 10% chance of dying? That feels a lot scarier, even though both statements mean the exact same thing. This is the power of how risk is framed. The way information is presented, whether it emphasizes gains or losses, completely changes how we react. People are far more comfortable with risk when it's framed positively. A politician boasting about a plan that will save 80% of jobs sounds reassuring, but if they admitted it would cost 20% of jobs, the reaction would be much more negative. Same numbers, different emotional impact. Marketers, politicians, and even scientists use this trick all the time. A product advertised as 95% effective sounds far more appealing than one with a 5% failure rate. A financial advisor recommending an investment that has an 80% chance of profit will get more takers than if they warned of a 20% chance of loss. It's not deception, it's psychology. But this bias can backfire. A person who avoids an option just because it's framed negatively might miss out on a great opportunity. Someone who embraces a risk just because it sounds positive might underestimate the potential downsides. The real trick isn't just recognizing how information is framed, it's learning to reframe it yourself. Next time you hear a statistic, ask yourself, would I feel the same way if this were phrased differently? Because often, the way a risk is presented matters more than the risk itself. Endowment effect. Imagine you're at a yard sale, casually browsing through a table of knickknacks. You spot an old coffee mug, nothing special, just a plain ceramic cup. If asked how much you'd pay for it, you might shrug and say, maybe a couple of dollars. But now, flip the scenario. Suppose that same mug is already yours. Someone offers to buy it. Suddenly, it doesn't seem so cheap anymore. Now, you feel like it's worth at least $5, maybe more. This shift in perception isn't about the mug's actual value. It's about ownership. The moment we possess something, we assign it greater worth than we would if it belonged to someone else. This is why people struggle to sell their old furniture at reasonable prices. why sentimental clutter piles up in garages, and why companies hand out free trial memberships. Because once something is yours, letting go feels like a loss. The effect is everywhere. Investors hold on to bad stocks, convinced they're worth more than they really are. People resist selling an old car, even when repairs cost more than its market value. And if you've ever found it hard to part with an item just because you've had it forever, you've felt this bias firsthand. Recognizing this mental trap can help us make smarter decisions. Just because we own something doesn't mean it's worth what we think. The real question is, if this weren't mine already, how much would I actually be willing to pay for it? Sometimes the hardest thing to do is see things the way they really are, not just the way we want them to be. Status quo bias. You've been using the same old phone for years. The battery drains fast, the screen is cracked, and the camera takes blurry photos. A brand new model just dropped, packed with upgrades. You could switch, but something holds you back. Your current phone still works, so why bother? That hesitation isn't just laziness. It's a deeply ingrained tendency to stick with what's familiar, even when a better option is right in front of us. People tend to resist change, not because they've carefully weighed the pros and cons, but simply because the current state feels safe. This is why companies struggle to get customers to switch brands, why employees stay in unfulfilling jobs for years, and why outdated policies and traditions linger long past their usefulness. The mind plays tricks to keep the status quo intact. It exaggerates the risks of change and downplays the potential benefits. A new gym routine. What if it's too hard? Moving to a new city. What if I hate it? But what we don't consider is the risk of not changing. How much time is wasted on inefficient habits? How many opportunities slip away because we're too comfortable with the way things are? Breaking free from this bias means asking a simple question. If I were starting fresh today, would I make the same choice? If the answer is no, maybe it's time to stop settling for what's familiar and start embracing what's possible. Change is uncomfortable, but so is staying stuck. Naive diversification. Ever found yourself in a situation where you're at an all-you-can-eat buffet? Faced with an overwhelming spread of options, you instinctively grab a little bit of everything. Some pasta, sushi, fried chicken, a spoonful of mashed potatoes, and maybe even a random dish you've never tried before. You're not sure if everything will taste good together, but at least you won't miss out on anything, right? This same instinct carries over into more serious decisions, like investing or planning for the future. When given multiple options, people tend to spread their choices evenly across them without deeply analyzing what's best. If you're given 5 investment funds, for example, you might allocate 20% to each without checking if one is riskier than the others. If you're picking college courses, you may sign up for an even mix of humanities and sciences without considering which aligns better with your career goals. It feels like a safe strategy. Diversification is smart, after all. But the problem is in the naive part. Instead of carefully evaluating each option, we assume balance itself is the key. In reality, this can lead to bad decisions, like investing too much in risky stocks just because they were part of the available selection, or filling your schedule with unnecessary obligations just because you didn't want to favor one thing over another. The next time you find yourself evenly spreading your choices without much thought, take a step back. Are you really diversifying wisely, or are you just trying to feel like you're making a well-balanced decision? Sometimes less is more, but only when you choose wisely. Prospect theory. Try to picture yourself you're planning a weekend getaway to a scenic countryside retreat. You have 2 options. One is a comfortable, well-reviewed resort that guarantees a pleasant stay, and the other is an off-the-beaten-path cabin in the woods that promises an unforgettable adventure, but comes with uncertainties, perhaps a rustic environment that might lack comfort, or unpredictable weather that could dampen your plans. Most people, when faced with the choice of a sure, enjoyable experience versus a risky, potentially extraordinary one, tend to choose the safe resort. They value the certainty of a good time over the chance for an exceptional, albeit uncertain, adventure. This everyday decision illustrates the essence of prospect theory. Developed by Daniel Kahneman and Amos Tversky, this theory reveals that our choices are influenced more by the way options are presented, framed in terms of gains or losses, than by the actual outcomes. In our getaway example, the resort represents a clear gain, a guaranteed positive experience. In contrast, the cabin, despite its potential for an extraordinary escape, carries the risk of disappointment or discomfort, which our minds weigh much more heavily. The potential for loss, in this case, the loss of a comfortable and predictable experience, often pushes us towards risk aversion when we face gains. However, when faced with the prospect of a certain loss, our behavior can flip. Imagine instead that you are forced to cancel your weekend plans, which would certainly ruin your mood. Now, you're offered the choice between a guaranteed cancellation, a sure loss of relaxation, and taking a chance on the off-the-beaten-path cabin. Suddenly, the uncertain option becomes more appealing because it offers a chance to avoid the guaranteed loss of your cherished getaway. This shift in preference is at the heart of prospect theory. We are more willing to take risks when trying to avert losses than when securing gains. In essence, our decision-making is not purely logical. It's deeply affected by our emotional response to potential gains and losses. The next time you face a choice, consider how the framing might be swaying your decision. Sometimes, what seems like a safe bet might be hiding an opportunity for something truly extraordinary. Mental accounting. Let's say you're in a scenario where you just won $200 from a scratch-off lottery ticket. Later that day, you go out for dinner and splurge on an expensive meal, justifying it by thinking, it's free money anyway. But if your paycheck had gone up by $200 instead, would you have spent it the same way? Probably not. That's mental accounting at work. People don't treat all money the same. Instead, we mentally divide it into categories: salary, savings, bonuses, gifts, gambling winnings. And depending on where the money comes from, we spend it differently. Found money, like tax refunds or work bonuses, feels less real, so we're more likely to blow it on luxuries. Meanwhile, salary is treated as hard-earned and spent carefully, even if in reality, all money is the same. Casinos and marketing experts use this against you. That's why casinos give players chips instead of real cash. When you don't see physical money leaving your hands, you take bigger risks. Ever notice how stores offer rebates instead of direct discounts? They know you'll mentally separate that future refund from your main budget, making you more likely to buy. The danger of mental accounting is that it tricks us into poor financial decisions. You might insist on keeping money in a vacation fund while struggling to pay off high-interest debt, or refuse to dip into savings to avoid overdraft fees, even though the fees cost more than the interest you're earning. The key is to step back and ask, if this were just part of my total wealth, would I still make this choice? Because at the end of the day, money doesn't care what category you put it in, but your future self definitely will. Recency bias. Picture you're watching a basketball game. Your team has been leading the entire match, but in the final minute, the opposing team scores a few quick points and wins. Despite your team's overall great performance, all you can think about is how they choked at the end. This is recency bias in action. Recency bias is our tendency to give more weight to recent events while ignoring the bigger picture. It's why a single bad day at work can make you feel like your job is terrible, even if you've had months of success. It's why people panic and sell their stocks during a market dip, forgetting years of steady growth. Our brains are wired to prioritize the latest information, often at the expense of rational thinking. This effect can influence everything from decision-making to memory. Consider students who cram for a test the night before. They feel confident because the material is fresh in their minds, but when asked about older concepts, they struggle. Politicians also take advantage of recency bias, timing big announcements or scandals carefully so voters remember only what happened most recently. The problem with recency bias is that it distorts reality. A single moment doesn't define an entire experience, yet our brains act as if it does. The key to overcoming it? Take a step back. Ask yourself, am I judging the full picture or just reacting to what happened last? Because sometimes the last thing we remember isn't the most important. It's just the loudest. Primacy effect. Think back to the first day of school. You meet your new teacher, and within seconds, you form an opinion. Maybe they smiled warmly, and you instantly liked them. Or maybe they seemed strict, and you decided their class would be miserable. Weeks later, even if their behavior changes, that first impression still sticks in your mind. This is the primacy effect at work. The primacy effect is our tendency to remember and prioritize the first piece of information we receive, often shaping our long-term perception. This bias explains why first impressions matter so much in job interviews, dating, and even advertising. If a brand introduces itself with an unforgettable slogan or a powerful ad, it stays with you, influencing your opinion even if later experiences are mediocre. It's not just about people and brands, it affects how we learn. Imagine you're given a long list of words and asked to recall as many as possible. Studies show you're most likely to remember the first few words far better than those in the middle. Your brain gives extra importance to what comes first, treating it as foundational knowledge. This effect can be both a gift and a trap. It helps us process information quickly, but it also makes us resistant to changing our minds. If you assume someone is untrustworthy based on your first encounter, it's hard to shake that belief, even if they later prove themselves reliable. So next time you catch yourself clinging to a first impression, pause and ask, am I seeing the full picture, or just the part my brain decided was most important? Because sometimes, what comes first isn't always what matters most. Von Restorff effect. Suppose you're looking at a long grocery list. Apples, bread, milk, eggs, octopus, rice, cheese, cereal. Wait, octopus? That one word jumps out at you, right? Even if you forget most of the list, chances are you'll remember the octopus. That's the von Restorff effect in action. This psychological trick, also known as the isolation effect, explains why we remember things that stand out from the rest. When something is different, unusual, or unexpected, our brains latch onto it. This is why a single bright pink sticky note on a wall of white ones catches your attention, or why an oddly dressed person in a crowd sticks in your memory. Our brains are wired to focus on what breaks the pattern. Marketers and advertisers use this effect constantly. A bizarre commercial, an unusual product name, or an oddly shaped package makes you more likely to remember and prefer a brand. It's also why highlighters exist. By making key points visually distinct, they become easier to recall. But this effect doesn't just influence memory, it shapes how we perceive events. If you have a relatively uneventful year, but one embarrassing moment at a party, you might remember the entire year through the lens of that single standout event. It also plays a role in how we judge people. A single act of extreme kindness or rudeness can overshadow everything else someone does, making them seem much better or worse than they really are. So, next time you struggle to remember something important, make it stand out. Use color, humor, or absurdity to your advantage. Because in a world of sameness, the unusual is what sticks. Focusing effect. If you could move to a sunny beach town tomorrow, would you be happier? Most people would say yes. After all, who wouldn't prefer palm trees and ocean breezes over traffic jams and gloomy weather? But here's the catch. Studies show that people who move to so-called paradise locations aren't actually any happier in the long run. This is because of the focusing effect, a psychological trick where we overemphasize one factor while ignoring everything else that contributes to an experience. The focusing effect makes us believe that a single feature, like great weather, a high salary, or a prestigious school, will dramatically improve our lives. We fixate on that one aspect and assume it will make or break our happiness. But in reality, life is a mix of countless elements, and no single factor dictates how we feel. Sure, moving to a beach town sounds wonderful, but will it eliminate daily stress? Will it change your relationships, your health, or your sense of purpose? Probably not. This bias affects our decisions all the time. When buying a car, we might obsess over gas mileage but forget about comfort. When choosing a job, we might focus entirely on salary while ignoring work-life balance. Even in relationships, we can get caught up in someone's attractiveness or success while overlooking deeper compatibility. The problem with the focusing effect is that it tricks us into making short-sighted decisions. We convince ourselves that one shiny detail will determine our happiness, only to realize later that life is much more complicated. So before you pin all your hopes on one thing, ask yourself, am I seeing the whole picture, or just the part that's easiest to focus on? Because sometimes the key to happiness isn't what we look at, it's what we fail to see. Planning fallacy. You tell yourself this time will be different. The last time you had a project due, you swore you wouldn't procrastinate again, so you plan everything out. 1 week should be plenty. Maybe even a few days will do. You feel confident, almost excited. And then, somehow, you're pulling an all-nighter, scrambling to finish, wondering where all that time went. People are terrible at predicting how long things will take. Whether it's writing an essay, renovating a kitchen, or finishing a major work project, we almost always assume it'll go smoothly and wrap up faster than it actually does. The result? Missed deadlines, last-minute stress, and a sense of, how did I let this happen again? It's not just individuals. This happens on a massive scale. The Sydney Opera House was supposed to take 4 years to build. It took 14. The original budget for the Boston Big Dig was $2.8 billion. It ended up costing 10 times that. Even seasoned experts fall into the same trap. We underestimate obstacles, assume the best-case scenario, and forget to factor in delays, mistakes, or unexpected setbacks. Why does this happen? Partly because our brains love a clean, optimistic version of the future. We imagine the perfect execution of a plan where we work efficiently, nothing distracts us, and everything goes right. But reality isn't that neat. Unexpected problems always creep in, yet we rarely account for them. The best way to beat this illusion is to ask, if someone else were doing this, how long would I realistically expect them to take? Or better yet, look at how long similar tasks have taken in the past. You'll probably realize your quick project might not be so quick after all. And knowing that might be the only way to finally finish something on time. Procrastination bias. You sit down at your desk, ready to start that important task. But first, maybe a quick scroll through your phone. Just a few minutes. Then suddenly, an hour has vanished, and you tell yourself, I'll start fresh tomorrow. But when tomorrow comes, the cycle repeats. We convince ourselves that later will be a better time to start. We imagine that our future selves will be more motivated, more focused, and free of distractions. But that future self, it's just you, with the same habits, the same tendencies, and the same urge to put things off. The real trick of this bias is that we don't recognize it as procrastination. We rationalize it. I'll be in a better headspace tomorrow. I need to do more research first. I'll work better under pressure anyway. But these are just stories we tell ourselves to justify avoiding discomfort. Our brains are wired to prioritize short-term rewards. Watching a video, answering a message, grabbing a snack, over long-term benefits that require effort. This is why deadlines seem to sneak up on us, even though they were always there. It's why people delay saving for retirement, putting off exercise, or waiting until panic sets in to finally start that project. We assume there will be plenty of time later. And then, suddenly, there isn't. Breaking free from this trap isn't about finding the perfect time. It's about recognizing that no future moment will feel any easier than right now. The trick? Start small. 5 minutes of effort is better than waiting for the mythical right moment. Because in the end, the only thing standing between you and progress is the illusion that your future self will somehow be different from who you are today. Satisficing. You need a new laptop, you do some research, compare specs, check reviews, and 2 hours later, you're drowning in options. Should you get the one with better battery life or the one with a faster processor? Do you spend extra for a higher refresh rate? You're paralyzed by the choices. Finally, exhausted, you settle on a laptop that meets your needs, even if it's not perfect. And just like that, you've satisficed. Satisficing is the art of choosing something that's good enough, instead of endlessly searching for the absolute best. It's a shortcut our brains use to avoid decision fatigue. Unlike maximizers, who obsess over making the most optimal choice, satisficers recognize when a decision meets their criteria and move on. It's not laziness, it's efficiency. Think about grocery shopping. If you needed the perfect loaf of bread, you'd inspect every option, compare ingredient lists, and maybe even read online reviews. A satisficer, on the other hand, just grabs a loaf that looks fine and moves on. The result? Less stress, more time, and a perfectly decent sandwich. This approach doesn't mean settling for bad choices. It means knowing when good enough really is enough. Studies show that maximizers tend to be less satisfied with their decisions, even if they make objectively better ones. Why? Because they can't stop wondering if they could have done better. Meanwhile, satisficers make a choice, trust it, and free up their mental energy for more important things. In a world overflowing with choices, knowing when to stop searching is a superpower. The next time you're stuck weighing endless options, ask yourself, will this choice serve its purpose? If the answer is yes, move on. The best decision isn't always the one with the most research. It's the one that lets you live your life. Bounded rationality. Picture this. You're in a massive supermarket, standing in front of an aisle filled with hundreds of different cereal boxes. You don't have the time or the mental energy to analyze every single one. So, you do what most people do. You grab a familiar brand, check the price, maybe glance at the sugar content, and call it a day. It feels like a logical decision, but in reality, you've barely scratched the surface of all possible choices. This is how people make decisions in the real world, through shortcuts, simplifications, and mental limits. The idea that humans make perfectly rational choices is a myth. Instead, our decisions are constrained by time, available information, and our own mental capacity. This is called bounded rationality. Think about job hunting. In a perfect world, you'd research every company, analyze long-term growth potential, compare salaries, and even investigate company culture before applying. But no one does that. Instead, you apply to places that seem good enough based on quick judgments, perhaps a familiar company name, a decent job title, or a recommendation from a friend. You make the best decision you can, given the time and effort you're willing to invest. Bounded rationality explains why we rely on gut feelings, rules of thumb, and mental shortcuts instead of exhaustively analyzing every decision. It's not a flaw. It's a survival mechanism. If we tried to make every choice perfectly, we'd never get anything done. The real trick isn't eliminating these limitations. It's knowing when they help and when they hurt. Sometimes, quick decisions are good enough. But other times, especially for life-changing choices, it's worth stepping back and asking, am I deciding based on convenience or actual logic? Because while we may never be perfectly rational, we can still be strategically irrational. Heuristic decision-making. You're in the grocery store, trying to choose between two brands of coffee. One has sleek minimalist packaging and a label that says premium blend. The other is in a plain bag with no fancy branding. Without thinking too hard, you grab the premium-looking one. After all, it must be better, right? This is how the brain makes quick decisions using mental shortcuts. Instead of analyzing every detail, we rely on simple cues, like branding, price, or familiarity, to reach a conclusion fast. These shortcuts, or heuristics, save time and effort, allowing us to navigate daily life without overthinking. But while they make decision-making easier, they also lead to errors. Imagine a job interview. A well-dressed, confident candidate walks in, shakes hands firmly, and speaks with ease. Instantly, they seem competent. Another candidate, equally qualified but nervous, fumbles their words. Even if their resumes are identical, the first person is more likely to get the job. This happens because the brain equates confidence with capability, a heuristic at work. Marketers and politicians take full advantage of this. A product with 99% effective on the label seems more reliable than one that says 1% failure rate, even though they mean the same thing. A candidate who looks presidential might gain support even if their policies are weak. These shortcuts are deeply ingrained, but they're not inescapable. Pausing to question a snap judgment. Why does this product seem better? Am I making an assumption based on appearance? Can lead to better choices. The brain loves efficiency, but sometimes slowing down is the smartest move. Change blindness. You're at a restaurant, deep in conversation with a friend. The waiter takes your order, nods, and walks away. A few minutes later, a different waiter brings your food, but you don't even notice the switch. Sound impossible? It's not. This is change blindness, a strange quirk of the human mind where we fail to notice significant changes in our environment. It happens because, despite what we like to believe, we don't take in every detail around us. Our brains prioritize efficiency over precision, focusing on the bigger picture rather than storing every minor change. Scientists have tested this in fascinating ways. In one experiment, participants were shown two nearly identical images, flashing back and forth with a brief blank screen in between. Even when the difference was obvious, a missing object, a color change, it often took people several seconds to notice. Without direct attention, even major shifts can slip past us. But this effect isn't limited to simple tests. It plays a role in real life too. Magicians use it to make objects vanish in plain sight. Drivers might not notice a motorcycle merging next to them because their focus is elsewhere. Even eyewitness testimony can be unreliable. Someone could swear nothing changed, even when a crucial detail did. What's most unsettling is that change blindness makes us overconfident. We think we see everything, but our perception is full of blind spots. So the next time you walk into a familiar room, take a closer look. That picture frame, that chair, are they exactly where they were yesterday? Or has something changed right in front of you without you even realizing? Inattentional blindness. You're watching a video of people passing a basketball, counting how many times the players in white jerseys make a pass. You focus hard, tracking the ball as it moves. Later, when asked about the video, you confidently give the correct number. But then comes the real question. Did you see the gorilla? Wait, what gorilla? This is inattentional blindness, a phenomenon where we fail to see something right in front of us because our attention is elsewhere. In the famous invisible gorilla experiment, participants were so focused on counting passes that nearly half of them completely missed a person in a gorilla suit walking through the scene, pausing, and even beating their chest. It sounds ridiculous. How could anyone miss something so obvious? But this happens all the time in daily life. If you've ever searched for your keys only to find them in your hand, or driven past your turn because you were focused on something else, you've experienced inattentional blindness firsthand. Our brains are wired to filter out unnecessary details, prioritizing only what we believe is important in the moment. This can have serious consequences. Pilots have overlooked warning lights. Doctors have missed glaring signs on medical scans. Drivers fail to see pedestrians or cyclists because they weren't expecting them. The danger isn't just that we miss things, it's that we're completely unaware we missed them. So, what else have you failed to notice today? That email you swear you never got, the friend's haircut you didn't acknowledge, the small but crucial detail in a decision you made. The world is full of things hiding in plain sight, not because they're invisible, but because your mind decided they weren't worth seeing. Choice blindness. Imagine you're in a psychology experiment where you're shown two photos of strangers and asked to choose the one you find more attractive. Simple, right? You make your choice, and the researcher hands you the photo you picked. Then they ask why you found this person more appealing. But here's the catch. You've been tricked. The researcher secretly swapped the photo for the one you didn't choose. And yet, without hesitation, you begin explaining why this was your pick all along. This is choice blindness, a strange psychological phenomenon where people fail to notice when their own choices are switched, and even go on to defend decisions they never actually made. It's been demonstrated in everything from politics to shopping. In studies, people have confidently justified opinions they never held, flavors they never preferred, and products they never actually picked. Why does this happen? Our brains like to believe we're in control of our decisions, so when we're confronted with an inconsistency, we unconsciously rewrite reality to maintain a sense of coherence. Rather than admitting we might not remember our own choices, we instinctively rationalize them after the fact. Think about what this means in real life. Have you ever passionately defended a decision only to later realize you don't even remember why you made it? Ever been convinced you picked one thing but ended up with another and just went along with it? Choice blindness shows us that our sense of certainty is more fragile than we think. If we can so easily be fooled into believing we chose something we didn't, how many of our past choices are just stories we've created after the fact? Illusion of control. You're at a casino, gripping the dice tightly before rolling. You shake them just right, blowing on them for luck, convinced that your technique affects the outcome. The reality, it doesn't. The dice don't care, yet somehow it feels like they do. This is a perfect example of how the mind tricks us into believing we have control over random events. From gamblers swearing by rituals to people mashing elevator buttons to make it arrive faster, we constantly overestimate our influence. Even in financial markets, investors believe their personal strategies will outsmart randomness, when in reality, luck often plays a bigger role than they admit. The illusion of control isn't just about superstition. It's deeply wired into how we function. Studies show that people prefer to pick their own lottery numbers, believing it increases their chances of winning, despite the odds being identical. In sports, fans think their cheers affect the game. In business, leaders assume their success is purely due to skill, not circumstance. This bias can be both a blessing and a curse. On one hand, it gives people confidence, pushing them to take risks and persevere. On the other, it can lead to overconfidence, believing you can control outcomes that are actually beyond your reach. That's how traders lose fortunes, how gamblers keep betting, and how people stay in bad situations thinking they can fix them. So, next time you find yourself gripping the dice, making a wish, or believing you can control something unpredictable, pause. A little belief in control can be motivating, but knowing when to let go, that's real power. Curse of knowledge. Have you ever tried to explain something to someone only to feel frustrated when they just don't get it? You swear it's simple, obvious even, but to them, it's like you're speaking another language. That frustration, it's not their fault. It's the curse of knowledge. The curse of knowledge is a cognitive bias that makes it difficult for people who know something to imagine what it's like not to know it. The moment you become an expert, whether in physics, programming, or even just a game you love, you lose the ability to see it from a beginner's perspective. What's second nature to you is completely foreign to someone else. A famous experiment illustrates this effect perfectly. Researchers asked one group to tap out a simple song, like Happy Birthday, on a table, while another group tried to guess the tune. The tappers assumed their listeners would instantly recognize it. They could hear the melody clearly in their minds, but the listeners, lacking that internal soundtrack, rarely guessed correctly. The tappers were cursed by their own knowledge, unable to imagine what it was like to hear only disconnected beats. This bias is everywhere. Teachers struggle to simplify lessons because they forget what it's like to be a student. Bosses give vague instructions, assuming employees understand their thought process. Even in relationships, people assume their partner should just know what they mean. Breaking free from the curse of knowledge takes effort. It means slowing down, breaking things into steps, and remembering what it was like before you knew. Because the smarter you are, the harder it is to see through the eyes of someone who isn't, and that can be the biggest blind spot of all. One of the most simple and common mental traps people fall into is confirmation bias, one that quietly shapes our beliefs without us even realizing it. Imagine you're in a debate about a topic you feel strongly about. You search online for proof that you're right, and sure enough, you find articles, studies, and expert opinions that support your view. See, the facts back me up, you think. But did you ever stop to consider the evidence against your position? Or did you only look for information that confirmed what you already believed? This is confirmation bias in action. Our tendency to seek out, interpret, and remember information that supports our existing beliefs while ignoring or dismissing anything that contradicts them. It's why people with different political opinions can look at the same event and come away with completely different conclusions. It's why superstitions persist, conspiracy theories thrive, and long-held misconceptions refuse to die. Once an idea takes root in our minds, our brain instinctively works to defend it, even at the cost of reality. Psychologist Peter Wason demonstrated this in the 1960s with a simple experiment. He gave people a number sequence and asked them to determine the rule behind it. Instead of testing a variety of possibilities, most people only looked for evidence that confirmed their initial guess, never stopping to challenge their assumptions. This same mistake happens everywhere, from scientific research to courtroom decisions to everyday arguments with friends. What makes confirmation bias so dangerous is that it feels like rational thinking. It tricks us into believing we're being objective when we're actually just reinforcing our own mental echo chamber. The only way to break free is to do something uncomfortable. Actively seek out opposing viewpoints, challenge our own assumptions, and stay open to the idea that we could be wrong. Because sometimes, the truth isn't what we want to hear. It's what we refuse to accept. Availability heuristic. The availability heuristic is one of the easiest psychological shortcuts to fall for, because it feels like common sense. Picture this. You're about to board a plane when you suddenly remember a recent news report about a plane crash. Your heart races. Flying suddenly feels terrifying, even though statistically it's far safer than driving. Meanwhile, you don't think twice about getting into a car, despite the fact that car accidents claim thousands of lives every day. This is the availability heuristic at work. A mental shortcut where we judge the likelihood of an event based on how easily we can recall similar examples. If something comes to mind quickly, like a shark attack, a violent crime, or a lottery win, we assume it must be more common than it actually is. Our brains are wired for efficiency, so instead of carefully analyzing statistics, we rely on whatever examples are most available in our memory. This bias is why people overestimate the dangers of rare but dramatic events. News media thrives on this, bombarding us with stories about kidnappings, natural disasters, and freak accidents, things that make headlines precisely because they are unusual. Meanwhile, the slow, invisible dangers that actually kill more people, like heart disease or pollution, don't feel as urgent because they don't stick in our minds the same way. The availability heuristic doesn't just shape our fears. It influences everything from financial decisions to political opinions. If you keep hearing about economic downturns, you might assume the economy is worse than it actually is. If a few people complain about a product, you might think it's unreliable, even if the vast majority of users love it. So, how do you fight this bias? Start by questioning your gut reactions. When something feels obvious or common, take a step back and ask, is this actually true, or just easy to remember? Because sometimes the scariest things aren't the most dangerous. They're just the most talked about. Anchoring bias. Anchoring bias is one of the sneakiest ways our brains trick us, because we don't even realize it's happening. Imagine you walk into a store looking for a new jacket. The first one you see is priced at $500. Wow, that's expensive, you think. Then you spot another one for $250. Suddenly, it seems like a bargain, so you buy it. But here's the catch. If you had seen the $250 jacket first, you might have thought it was overpriced. The $500 price tag wasn't just a number, it was an anchor that shaped your entire perception of value. Anchoring bias is our tendency to rely too heavily on the first piece of information we receive when making decisions. That initial number, whether it's a price, a statistic, or a random guess, sets a reference point in our minds, influencing everything that follows. Car dealerships use this trick all the time. They start by showing you the highest priced model first, making the others seem more reasonable by comparison. Salary negotiations work the same way. The first number mentioned in a discussion tends to pull the final agreement closer to it. One experiment by psychologists Amos Tversky and Daniel Kahneman demonstrated this bias in a bizarre way. Participants spun a wheel that randomly landed on either 10 or 65, then were asked to estimate the percentage of African countries in the UN. The people who landed on 65 guessed a much higher number than those who landed on 10. The wheel was meaningless, but their brains latched onto the first number they saw and used it as a reference point. The scary part? Anchoring affects even experts. Judges give harsher sentences when they first see higher sentencing recommendations. Real estate agents judge property values differently depending on the first price they hear. Once an anchor is set, it's hard to escape its pull. The best defense against anchoring bias is to challenge your first impression. Before making a decision, ask yourself, am I thinking critically, or am I just stuck on the first number I saw? Because sometimes the truth isn't about what something is worth. It's about what you were led to believe it was worth. Framing effect. The framing effect is proof that how something is presented matters just as much, if not more, than the actual facts. Imagine you need surgery and the doctor tells you there's a 90% survival rate. That sounds pretty reassuring, right? But what if instead the doctor says there's a 10% chance of death? Suddenly, the same procedure feels much riskier, even though nothing has changed except the wording. The framing effect is a cognitive bias where people's decisions are influenced by how information is presented, rather than the information itself. We react differently to the same situation depending on whether it's framed in a positive or negative light. Marketers, politicians, and the media all use this trick to shape how we think, without us even realizing it. Take grocery stores, for example. You're more likely to buy beef labeled 80% lean than one labeled 20% fat, even though they're identical. A politician could say, unemployment has dropped to 5%, which sounds great, or millions of people are still unemployed, which sounds concerning. The facts don't change, but the perception does. In one famous study, psychologists Daniel Kahneman and Amos Tversky asked participants to choose between two medical treatments for a deadly disease. One was framed in terms of lives saved, the other in terms of lives lost. Even though the outcomes were mathematically the same, people overwhelmingly preferred the lives saved option. Our brains are wired to avoid losses, so we naturally gravitate toward choices that sound safer, even if they're no different. The framing effect influences everything from financial decisions to social issues to personal relationships. The next time you hear a statistic, an argument, or even a simple product description, stop and ask yourself, am I reacting to the facts or just the way they were presented? Because sometimes The difference between good and bad isn't reality. It's just a matter of wording. Hindsight bias. Hindsight bias is the reason everything seems obvious after it happens. Think about the last time a big news event unfolded. Maybe a company went bankrupt, a celebrity scandal erupted, or your favorite team lost a crucial game. Looking back, you might think, I knew that was going to happen. But did you really? Or does it just feel that way now that you have all the facts? Hindsight bias, also called the I knew it all along effect, is our tendency to believe past events were more predictable than they actually were. Once we know the outcome, our brains rewrite history, making it seem like we saw it coming, even if we didn't. This trick is so powerful that we genuinely convince ourselves we always knew the answer. Consider a shocking stock market crash. After it happens, analysts will point to all the obvious warning signs, signs they mostly ignored before the collapse. Sports fans claim they knew their team would lose, even though they were hopeful just hours before. This bias is why failed relationships, business mistakes, and political outcomes seem so predictable in hindsight. But if they were truly obvious, why didn't we act on them beforehand? One study by psychologists Baruch Fischhoff and Ruth Baith demonstrated this perfectly. Participants were asked to predict the outcome of Richard Nixon's 1972 trip to China. Later, when told the real results, they misremembered their original guesses, believing they had been more accurate than they actually were. Hindsight bias doesn't just distort memory, it erases uncertainty, making past events seem inevitable. The danger of hindsight bias is that it makes us overconfident in our ability to predict the future. It tricks us into thinking we understand the world better than we do, leading to poor decisions and an inability to learn from mistakes. The truth is, life is full of surprises, but our brains prefer a neatly written story where everything makes sense in retrospect. Representativeness heuristic. Imagine you meet a quiet, book-loving man who wears glasses and enjoys poetry. Is he more likely to be a librarian or a farmer? If you're like most people, you'd probably guess librarian. But here's the twist. There are far more farmers in the world than librarians, meaning statistically, he's more likely to be a farmer. This simple mistake is a perfect example of the representativeness heuristic, a mental shortcut where we judge how likely something is based on how much it fits our mental stereotype rather than actual probability. Our brains love patterns, so we tend to group things based on similarities. If someone looks, acts, or behaves in a way that matches a familiar category, we assume they belong there, without considering the bigger picture. This can lead to snap judgments that feel right but are often wrong. For example, if you hear about a startup founder who wears hoodies and dropped out of college, you might assume they'll be the next Steve Jobs or Mark Zuckerberg. But in reality, most startups fail, and most dropouts don't become billionaires. The stereotype tricks us into ignoring the odds. In a famous experiment by psychologists Amos Tversky and Daniel Kahneman, participants read a description of a woman named Linda, who was outspoken and passionate about social justice. Then, they were asked whether she was more likely to be A, a bank teller, or B, a bank teller, active in the feminist movement. Most people chose option B, despite the fact that it's statistically less probable. Why? Because feminist activists fit their mental image of Linda better, even though simple logic says she's more likely to just be a bank teller. The representativeness heuristic shapes everything from hiring decisions to jury verdicts to who we trust. The next time you make a judgment about someone or something, ask yourself, am I basing this on reality or just on what seems to fit? Because sometimes our instincts don't lead us to the truth, they lead us to the most familiar story. Affect heuristic. Picture you're at the grocery store, trying to decide between two brands of peanut butter. One has sleek, modern packaging with a clean design. The other looks outdated, with dull colors and an unappealing label. Without thinking too much, you grab the first one. Why? Because it feels like the better choice. This is the affect heuristic in action. a mental shortcut where our emotions guide our decisions more than logic or facts. The affect heuristic is the reason we instinctively trust people with warm smiles, assume expensive products are higher quality, and fear things that sound dangerous, even when they aren't. Our brains love efficiency, and instead of carefully analyzing every decision, we often rely on gut feelings. If something gives us a positive emotional response, we view it as good, safe, or valuable. If it triggers fear or discomfort, we see it as bad, risky, or undesirable. Marketers use this trick against us all the time. Ever noticed how political ads rarely focus on policies, but instead try to stir up fear or admiration? Or how commercials for junk food don't list the ingredients, but show happy families enjoying a meal? That's because emotions, not facts, drive our choices. Even in the legal system, research has shown that a defendant who looks remorseful is more likely to receive a lenient sentence than one who appears cold, regardless of the evidence. The real danger of the affect heuristic is that it can lead to poor judgment. We might dismiss good advice because we don't like the person giving it, or underestimate real risks because they don't feel scary. So the next time you're making a decision, ask yourself, am I thinking or just feeling? Because sometimes the mind's shortcuts take us in the wrong direction. Familiarity heuristic. Have you ever wondered why you keep ordering the same meal at your favorite restaurant, even when there are dozens of other options? It's not because it's objectively the best choice, it's because it's familiar. This is the familiarity heuristic at work, a mental shortcut where our brains favor things we recognize over things we don't, even when the unfamiliar option might be better. This cognitive bias explains why people tend to prefer brands they've heard of, even if they're lower quality. It's why we instinctively trust familiar faces and why pop songs seem to get catchier the more we hear them. Familiarity creates comfort, and comfort often tricks us into thinking something is good, simply because we've encountered it before. The familiarity heuristic is helpful in some ways. It saves time by allowing us to make quick decisions without overanalyzing every option. But it can also lead to flawed thinking. For example, studies show that people are more likely to believe false information if they've heard it multiple times, even if they know it's untrue. The more often we see or hear something, the more real or valid it feels, regardless of actual evidence. This bias even influences relationships. We tend to be drawn to people we see often, classmates, co-workers, or even celebrities, not necessarily because they're better people, but because repeated exposure makes them feel more trustworthy. The danger of the familiarity heuristic is that it can trap us in the illusion of safety. We stick with what we know instead of exploring new opportunities. So, next time you find yourself choosing the same thing simply because it feels comfortable, ask yourself, is this truly the best option, or just the one I recognize? False dichotomy. You're either with us or against us. It sounds dramatic, powerful, like a clear line has been drawn. But what if you support some ideas on both sides? What if there's a middle ground? That's the problem with false dichotomies. They force complex issues into black and white choices when reality is usually far more nuanced. This fallacy shows up in politics, debates, and even personal relationships. A parent might tell their child, either you study medicine or you'll end up a failure, ignoring the possibility of countless successful careers beyond being a doctor. A company might claim, you either buy our product or you're missing out, as if those are the only two options. These arguments create the illusion that there are only two possible choices, one good, one bad, when in fact there could be many. The danger of this thinking is that it limits perspective. When people believe they must pick a side, they stop looking for alternative solutions. Compromise disappears, creativity is stifled, and worst of all, discussions become battles instead of conversations. Life is rarely a simple this or that decision. Most of the time, the truth exists somewhere in between. The real challenge isn't choosing one side. It's recognizing that the choices we're given aren't always the only ones that exist. Bandwagon fallacy. At some point, you've probably seen a long line outside a restaurant and thought, that place must be amazing. Maybe you've even joined the line yourself, assuming that so many people couldn't possibly be wrong. But here's the catch. Those people might just be following the crowd too. This is the essence of the bandwagon fallacy. The idea that something must be true, good, or valuable just because a lot of people believe in it. It's the logic behind fads, viral trends, and why everyone suddenly seems to love a movie you've never heard of until yesterday. The more people who buy into something, the more convincing it becomes, even if there's little actual evidence behind it. History is filled with examples of this thinking gone wrong. In the 17th century, people lost fortunes during the Dutch tulip mania, convinced that the skyrocketing price of tulip bulbs would never fall. In the early 2000s, millions of investors jumped into the dot-com bubble, certain that every internet company would succeed, until the crash proved otherwise. In both cases, the crowd wasn't proof of truth. It was proof of mass delusion. The bandwagon fallacy isn't just about big trends. It seeps into everyday life. A person might support a political candidate just because everyone else does, without researching their policies. A student might start wearing a certain brand because it's cool, without actually liking the clothes. A bad idea doesn't become a good one just because it's popular, and a good idea doesn't lose value just because it's overlooked. Thinking independently isn't always easy, especially when the crowd is loud. But next time you feel pulled in a direction just because everyone else is doing it, take a step back. Popularity and truth aren't the same thing, and sometimes the best decisions are the ones that go against the grain. Post hoc ergo propter hoc. A man wears his lucky socks to a football game. His team wins. He wears them again next week. Another victory. Soon he's convinced those socks have magical powers. This kind of thinking is the basis of post hoc ergo propter hoc, a Latin phrase meaning after this, therefore because of this. It's the mistaken belief that if one event happens before another, the first must have caused the second. It's a logical shortcut that our brains love to take, but it often leads us down the wrong path. Superstitions thrive on this fallacy. A student aces a test after using a special pencil, and now it becomes their lucky charm. A friend gets sick after eating sushi and swears off Japanese food forever. But correlation is not causation. The test was likely a result of studying, not the pencil, and the illness could have come from something else entirely. This fallacy doesn't just shape personal beliefs. It has real-world consequences. In the past, people blamed comets for plagues, thinking that one event must have caused the other. Even today, misleading health claims spread based on anecdotal evidence. Someone takes a new supplement and feels better, so they assume it must be the reason, without considering other factors. The tricky part is that sometimes cause and effect do exist, but assuming it without evidence can lead to false conclusions. Instead of jumping to connections, the best approach is to ask, is there actual proof that A caused B, or am I just seeing a coincidence? Because while lucky socks might make a great tradition, they won't win the game. Hard work and strategy will. Cum hoc ergo propter hoc. Ice cream sales and drowning deaths both rise in the summer. Clearly, eating ice cream must make people drown more often. Of course, that's ridiculous. But this kind of flawed reasoning is surprisingly common. It's called cum hoc ergo propter hoc, which translates to, with this, therefore because of this. It happens when two things occur together, and we assume one must be causing the other, even when there's no actual link. The real explanation: hot weather increases both ice cream consumption and swimming activity. More people in the water naturally means more drowning incidents, but the ice cream itself has nothing to do with it. This fallacy plays tricks on us in all kinds of ways. People assume that kids who play violent video games become more aggressive, without considering other factors like upbringing, environment, or personality. Studies might show that wealthy people tend to be healthier, but that doesn't mean money directly improves health. Access to better food, medical care, and less stress all play a role. News and social media fuel this mistake constantly. One study might report that people who drink more coffee tend to live longer. Another might claim that those who sleep less tend to be more successful. Are these things actually linked by cause and effect? Or are they simply happening at the same time due to some deeper hidden factor? Recognizing this fallacy is a crucial skill. Just because two things occur together doesn't mean one is responsible for the other. The next time someone confidently declares that A must be causing B, take a step back. Ask, could something else be at play? Because the truth is, sometimes ice cream is just ice cream. Sunk cost fallacy. You've already waited 45 minutes for your food at a restaurant. The service is awful, and you're starving. You could just leave and grab something quicker elsewhere. But then you think, I've already waited this long. What a waste if I leave now. So you stay, even if it means another 30 minutes of misery. This is the sunk cost fallacy in action. It's the tendency to stick with something, whether it's a bad meal, a failing business, or a toxic relationship, just because you've already invested time, money, or effort into it. The rational choice would be to ask, what's best for me moving forward? But instead, people get stuck thinking, I can't quit now, or everything I've spent will be wasted. It happens in all areas of life. Gamblers keep playing after losing big, convinced that if they stop now, all their losses will have been for nothing. Investors hold on to failing stocks, hoping to make back what they lost. Even governments fall into the trap, pouring billions into doomed projects simply because they've already spent billions before. The truth is, those past investments are already gone. Whether you keep suffering through them or walk away, that time, money, or energy isn't coming back. What matters is whether continuing makes sense now. If a movie is boring 30 minutes in, leaving doesn't mean wasting that time. It means saving yourself from wasting another hour. Breaking free from the sunk cost fallacy isn't easy. It means letting go of what you wish would happen and focusing on what actually makes sense. But once you do, decisions become clearer. Sometimes, the best move isn't pushing forward. It's cutting your losses and moving on. Placebo effect. Imagine taking a pill for your headache, only to find out later that it was nothing more than a sugar tablet. But strangely enough, your headache was gone. How is that possible? Welcome to the placebo effect, one of the strangest and most powerful psychological tricks our minds can play on us. The placebo effect happens when a person experiences real improvements in their condition simply because they believe they are receiving treatment, even when they aren't. It's not just wishful thinking. Scientific studies have shown that the brain releases chemicals like endorphins and dopamine in response to this belief, actually reducing pain and improving symptoms. Doctors have observed this phenomenon in everything from pain relief to depression treatment to even improving athletic performance. In one study, athletes who were unknowingly given a saline injection but told it was a performance-enhancing drug showed noticeable improvements in strength and endurance. Their belief in the treatment was enough to trick their bodies into performing better. But the placebo effect isn't always harmless. It can lead people to rely on fake treatments while ignoring real medical advice. It also raises ethical concerns. Should doctors prescribe placebos if they know it might help, even if it's based on deception? What's most fascinating about the placebo effect is what it reveals about human psychology. If belief alone can make us feel better, then how much of our experience of reality is shaped by what we expect? It's a reminder that sometimes our minds are more powerful than we think. The next time you feel an improvement after taking a pill, ask yourself, was it the medicine or was it you? Nocebo effect. Picture yourself going to the doctor, who warns you that a certain medication might cause nausea. The next day, you feel sick, except there's a catch. You were never given the medication. What you experienced is known as the nocebo effect, the dark twin of the placebo effect. While the placebo effect tricks your mind into feeling better, the nocebo effect does the opposite. It convinces you that you're experiencing negative symptoms, even when nothing harmful is actually happening. In one study, patients who were told they might experience headaches from a harmless treatment actually reported more headaches than those who weren't warned. It wasn't the treatment causing the symptoms, but their expectations of discomfort. This effect is particularly powerful in medical settings. Patients who are overly warned about side effects sometimes suffer from them purely because they expect to. In extreme cases, people have even died from the belief that they were terminally ill, despite later discovering that their diagnosis was incorrect. The mind's ability to influence the body is shockingly strong. The nocebo effect also plays out in everyday life. If you believe that working late will make you exhausted, you'll probably feel drained even if you had enough sleep. If you think a food will make you sick, you might start feeling nauseous before even eating it. Our expectations don't just color reality, they create it. The next time you hear about a possible side effect, a superstition, or a rumor about something being harmful, ask yourself, is this real, or am I making it real? Because sometimes, believing in the worst is enough to bring it to life. Recall bias. Think about the last time you were sick. Do you remember exactly what you ate before it happened? Chances are, you can easily recall one specific meal that now seems suspicious. Maybe it was that sushi from the new restaurant, or that slightly off-tasting sandwich. But was it really the cause? Or is your brain just making a convenient connection? This is recall bias, a mental shortcut where we selectively remember certain details while forgetting or distorting others, often because they fit a particular narrative. It's why people looking back on events tend to emphasize the things that stand out the most, rather than the full, objective reality. For example, in medical research, patients asked to recall past behaviors often unintentionally alter the truth. A person diagnosed with lung cancer might suddenly remember smoking more than they actually did, assuming it must have played a role. Meanwhile, someone without the disease might underreport their smoking habits. This skewed memory can lead to misleading conclusions in studies and reinforce incorrect beliefs. Recall bias also shows up in everyday life. If you've ever had a bad breakup, you might look back and remember mostly the red flags, forgetting the good times you once cherished. If you win a game, you'll likely recall the moments of brilliance, not the lucky breaks. Our minds aren't perfect record keepers, they're storytellers, shaping memories in ways that make the most sense emotionally. The tricky part? We trust our memories, even when they're flawed. So next time you find yourself confidently remembering something, ask yourself, is this what really happened? Or just what my brain wants me to believe? Because sometimes, the past isn't what it seems. It's just how we choose to recall it. Overconfidence effect. If you had to guess, how confident are you that you could spot a lie? Maybe 80%? 90%? Most people believe they're excellent at detecting deception. The truth? Studies show the average person is only slightly better than a coin flip, about 54% accurate. This is the overconfidence effect at work, a psychological phenomenon where people consistently overestimate their abilities, knowledge, or judgment. It's why most drivers think they're above average, why students overestimate their test scores, and why people make wildly inaccurate financial predictions with absolute certainty. The effect has real consequences. Doctors sometimes express excessive confidence in diagnoses, leading to misdiagnosis. Investors make risky bets, convinced they can predict market trends. In one infamous study, people were asked to answer general knowledge questions and rate their confidence in their answers. Even when they were 100% sure they were right, they were wrong about 40% of the time. Why does this happen? The brain dislikes uncertainty. Confidence feels good. It makes us feel in control. Admitting we don't know something is uncomfortable, so instead, we inflate our certainty, even when it's not justified. Ironically, those who are the least competent often have the highest confidence, a cognitive bias known as the Dunning-Kruger effect. Meanwhile, experts, aware of complexity and nuance, tend to be less certain in their judgments. So next time you catch yourself feeling completely sure about something, pause for a moment. Are you confident because you truly know, or just because it feels like you do? Sometimes, the smartest move isn't doubling down on our certainty. It's admitting that we might just be wrong.